Prague keeps gentle promises in daylight, steam lifting from cups in Mala Strana, the astronomical clock preening for applause, initials carved into bark along the Vltava. After dark, the city keeps a different promise, that silence is never empty. It has teeth. It has a needle's eye. Welcome to Somnolent Conspiracies, where we walk the margins of official history and listen for the pages that were torn out. Tonight's path leads to a door that ought to have vanished with its century. The entrance to a doll workshop sealed in the early 1920s, when the city tried to rub it from its own maps. On paper, it is a ruin collapsed beneath bureaucracy. In stone and wood, people still hear knocking. Always from the inside, the first story arrives like urban folklore. A student found at dawn on Charles Bridge, kneeling, hands pressed over her mouth as if it might fall off. When the medics eased her fingers away, they saw a perfect spiral of stitches, thread so fine it gleamed like mercury, biting with each pulse. A week later, a night watchman at the adjoining warehouse was discovered the same way. His lips sealed from within, the thread drawn tight as obedience. Inside the shuttered workshop, those who trespassed reported rows of benches set as if the shift had merely stepped out for air. Spools still glinted on their posts. Needles lay in ranks like tiny interrogations. And then, at midnight, the metal trembled. Patterns rattled across the scarred wood as if invisible hands were testing the air, seeking flesh to pierce. The dolls, dozens of them, watched with chalk-pale sockets and mouths sewn shut and disciplined, repeating motifs. The city would prefer a simple culprit. Pranksters, cultists, a bored technician with wire and a grudge. But the thread is antique, the records are missing, and the door, no matter how often it is boarded, keeps knocking. We are going to open it. The first calls sound like ordinary nuisances. A pale stutter of light behind a boarded window in Zizkov, the glint a broken bottle makes when it catches a street lamp, the shifting of a shadow that might only be a neighbor's curtain. A patrol car drifts past and slows, the officers peering through rain-scored glass at plywood nailed in a scab over a century-old door. Nothing moves. They note the address and roll on. By midnight, the operator's board ticks with a second call, then a third, each from a different street that curls around the same forgotten block as snugly as thread around a bobbin. It is an old factory row, soot-quiet and damp, the facades listing like tired teeth. In the middle of it stands the workshop. Its bricks are the color of dried blood. The lintels have sunk a finger's depth into the mortar, as if the building's own weight has been worrying at it for decades. The street knows the place. Dogs grow deferential as they pass, tails pressed to bellies, steps quickened. Some of the neighbors remember the year the city padlocked the door. Most remember only that it was long ago, and that nobody has ever been able to keep the boards in place for long. On the third night after the calls begin, two urban explorers arrive with a tripod and an algorithm to feed. They are young, gloved to the wrist, and thrilled by the cheap electricity of trespass. They pick the weakest board, knife at the nails, and slip through with a clumsy grace taught by repetition. The stream blinks live. Viewers multiply on their screens, a quiet roar of numbers. The lens pans. A long room humps out of darkness, benches on either side like pews in a chapel that worships fabric and thread. An iron stove squats cold in the corner. The floor is scabbed with old glue and good intentions. The camera schemes a low shelf. Labels in a faded, careful hand line the drawers like small epitaphs. Hair, lashes, sinew. The cursor wobbles. A smothered laugh leaks from behind the phone. They are not brave. They are buoyed by witnesses. The light slides across a row of dolls. Dozens, maybe hundreds, seated shoulder to shoulder as if waiting to be spoken for. Their eye sockets are white and blind, chalk rubbed into emptiness. Their mouths have been sewn shut with rough vigor, ends knotted and bitten off hard. A few heads tilt, deeply enough to imply attention. The watchers at home write nonsense in the rolling chat, but even nonsense falters when the phone dips close and the stitches come into focus. They are not random. The thread loops with a discipline that feels taut. Loop, cinch, cross. Loop, cinch, cross. The pattern repeats on faces of different sizes, as if obeying a score only the maker can hear. A hand there at the edge of the frame reaches out and fails to touch. The explorers cross the room, stepping awkwardly to avoid the doll's legs. A small metal drawer sticks, then yields with a sound like a sigh. Inside lies a single needle as long as a little finger. Its point is immaculate. The phone's light trembles. So does the needle. It is not a trick of breath. It is the distinct, insect-bright quiver of metal disturbed by motion in the air. The lens jerks upward to the rafters, to a latticework of dust and spider dragline. Something, somewhere above, winks with quicksilver and vanishes. The feed stutters and goes to black. At dawn, a passerby on Charles Bridge finds a girl kneeling with her forehead against the stone balustrade. Her hands are clamped over her mouth. She breathes hard through her nose like a runner who has overreached. When the rescuers ease her fingers away, the breath of the onlookers goes thin. The lips are sealed shut in a tightening spiral, the thread so fine it catches light like mercury poured from a height. It is not cotton or nylon. It is not anything that should be comfortable against skin. With every pulse of her heart, the coils bite a little deeper. Bulovka Hospital's maxillofacial unit assigns a surgeon with better hands than patience. Under magnification, the thread declares itself. A silver alloy drawn into hair-fine wire, edges soft from age, impurities that read like the flaw signature of a long-dead workshop. The surgeon looks around the tray as if a spool might be hiding among the clamps. There is no spool. There is only the flower of stitches and the girl's torn silence. He works with a watchmaker's breath, unpicking what he can. The damage to her throat, done from the inside by something that understood the map of her, will scar whether she wants it to or not. By mid-morning, the factory door wears fresh tape and a better lock. Uniforms hold the street at a respectful distance. Inside, the first police inventory reads like a tour through a patient's things after they have been sent away. Benches set square and tidy, as if the shift has merely stepped out for air. Spools still standing on their posts with the bland confidence of objects made to last. Needles ranked on flannel like small interrogations. Dust lies everywhere, generous as winter flower. Footprints show where the explorers went and nowhere deeper. A calendar on the wall has curled itself into a brittle scroll. The month frozen in 1923. Someone once worried the corner until it tore. A forensic photographer in a hood moves from bench to bench, making pictures of the mouths. He does not like looking at them. The stitches feel like a grammar he has not learned. In the viewfinder, the threads throw hairline shadows that darken on the round of each cheek like thin lines on a music staff. He lowers the camera and looks with his eyes. The room blunts to ordinary. The smell of machine oil, old cloth, damp brick. He lifts the camera again, and the frames come away stranger than he left them, as if the glass has remembered what the eye would rather misplace. Outside, the city's rumor engine warms. Clips from the failed stream bloom everywhere. Two teenagers might lurk with a phone and a tolerance for dread. Talk shows underline the bridge. Commentators roll their tongues around the phrase, cult prank. A professor with rich eyebrows explains that in times of stress, urban minds invent symbols to carry the weight of their anxieties. A parish priest says a prayer regarding mouths that sin and mouths that keep faith. Mothers tell children not to dare each other. Dogs refuse the block altogether. The neighbors sleep with their radios low, not for news but for human sound. In the municipal archive, a clerk with a slow cough pulls the lot book. He finds the page before the page he needs and the one after. The page he needs is missing. In the inspection files, he finds a report with its conclusions inked out to a papery bruise. In the union's minutes, he finds a meeting that was scheduled and then erased, the way a child rubs out a misspelled word until the paper thins and a hole comes. He is not paid to wonder, but he is a citizen of the same city, and the absence takes on the air of a presence. The building, he knows, stands. The books around it do not. By evening, the thread from the girl's mouth, carefully saved in a glass vial, has been to the lab and back. The note is clinical, the way fear sometimes is when it wears a lab coat. Finely drawn silver alloy, non-standard impurities consistent with early 20th century hand production. No match to contemporary manufacturers. The phrase "no match" walks the corridors and chills the gold leaf on old picture frames. It is a verdict without a culprit. The workshop itself resists clarifying. When an officer leans his weight on the inner door, it sways as if something on the other side has just leaned away. When a draft steals up from the floorboards, it smells very faintly of starch and ironed cotton. A thin thumping begins somewhere in the building just as dusk folds itself into the room. A sound patient enough to be plumbing and deliberate enough to be knuckles. It comes at irregular intervals and from no identifiable surface. The men drift nearer to each other without ever naming why. The lieutenant who signs the forms would like the matter to end with the forms. He mentions trespass and vandalism and the cost of overnight patrols. He mentions how easily fear passes from phone to phone. He does not mention the girl or her stitches. Those facts belong in a different conversation conducted behind a different door. He looks at the calendar, at the year no one can unpin, and feels a small tug as from a thread caught on a ring. By nightfall, the city has given the place a name again. It is not poetic. It is clear and efficient and ugly in the way truth can be. They call it the Silent Workshop, as if the building had chosen its own vow. The name sticks to the brick the way soot does. In a room whose windows do not open, a captain writes a memo that will later be denied with polite bafflement. The case needs a lead investigator. It needs someone whose skepticism is not bravado. It needs a team that will not go home just because the human part of the story has been rounded off by talking heads. He chooses Inspector Rodek for the simple reason that Rodek does not flinch from the quiet work. The floor plans, the chain of title, the terrible patience of sitting in a room with objects until they admit that someone touched them. Rodek is the kind of cop who wins the small fights and therefore sometimes the large ones. He reads the file twice, then a third time, circling the details that do not change when retold. Silver thread. No spool. A calendar stopped in 1923. Records gone where records ought to be most plentiful. Lights that come on behind boards thick enough to choke them. The doll mouth sewn with a discipline that implies instruction. He feels the tug again, not as superstition but as shape. A pattern wants to be learned. He signs the acceptance and collects the keys, the ordinary key that will turn the new padlock, and the older one with its heavy bit and stubborn wards that will fit some door in the building he has not yet found. He makes a list of names for the team. A photographer who has the appetite to wait, a scene technician with a steady core, a young officer whose curiosity has not yet learned to talk over its fear. He removes his coat from the back of the chair and looks once at the ceiling as if he might see rafters there, hear the dry whisper of thread unwinding. The city beyond his window is briefly tender in twilight, its rooftops softened to lids over their own dreams. Somewhere in the grain of that dream, the workshop knocks. It is a patient sound. It has been practicing for a century. The file slides across Rodek's desk. The forensic team assembles. The door in Zizkov waits for their hands. Inspector Rodek preferred rooms before people. Rooms held their motives in place. People were portable and dangerous. He arrived at the workshop with a small unit just after nightfall, a soft rain taping the streets shut behind them. The new padlock came off with a key, the older lock with a persuasion born of practice. The door opened inward as if sorry to be troubled. Entry logged at 1952, said Lenka Simic, scene tech. Her voice kept low from habit rather than fear. She clipped a light to her vest and handed out nitrile gloves. The rubber snapped around wrists with the quiet cheerlessness of hospitals. They moved the way a mouth learns to pronounce an unfamiliar word. Slowly, sounding each step. The benches waited exactly as they had earlier. Planes of scarred wood, metal feet, a few dark rings where mugs had once sweated warmth onto the grain. Spools gleamed along their posts, obedient and glossy. Dust rose and settled, as if thinking it over. Rodek walked the perimeter with his notebook open and his attention a narrow beam. He liked lists. Entry points, too obvious, one likely concealed. Sightlines, good from the stair, poor from the door. Hazards, rusted saws, loose boards, a stove that might still draw if asked. He paused at the wall calendar, not because he believed in talismans, but because no one had torn it down in a century. He made a small mark next to the month, the way a surveyor will lay a finger on a boundary stone to admit it exists. Power? He asked. Dead, Lenka said. We'll run our own. They unspooled cable from a portable battery and slung cold, clean light into the room. The illumination flattened the shadows to obedience but did nothing to shrink the space that hung above their heads, the dark volume between the rafters where the stream had lurched and died. Petra Novotna, the forensic photographer, set up her tripod beside a bench and began the slow work of measuring light with the back of her hand before trusting her meter. "Half second at 5/6, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Better bracket." Marek Vasic, the youngest of them, moved with the agitated caution of someone absorbing rules while pretending he already knew them. He held a small evidence box the way a child holds a cake he does not want to drop. "Do I tag the dolls individually?" he asked. "All of them," Rodek said without looking up. "But note the patterning on the stitches. If it repeats, we'll want to map the variation." Marek swallowed an objection. There were dozens. He sharpened a pencil and began to write numbers, squares and circles blooming on a page that would later look like a cemetery plan. The dolls were worse at night. Something about the light made their faces look more deliberate, as if the blank sockets had chosen not to see. The mouths were closer to correct, which was to say, they were wrong in ways that implied instruction. Marek leaned in to the nearest one and counted the loops like a child muttering an unfamiliar prayer. He could feel the thread with his breath, could almost hear it faintly creak where it passed through the punctures. Rodek finished the first circuit of the room and sketched the bench layout with a few economical lines. "No footprints beyond the known path," he said. "Dust adheres uniformly. Windows boarded from within, nails old, not recently disturbed." He angled his light at the stove. "Ash pan empty. No fuel. No warmth for years." "Except the lights," Petra said without lifting her eye from the viewfinder. "Except those," he agreed. Petra began shooting the mouths in sequence. Frontal, three-quarters, profile, detail. Her lens was good glass, forgiving and sharp. The stitches stacked themselves in her frames with an accuracy she distrusted. She looked up to rest her eyes and found herself looking toward the rafters against her will. The beam and truss work made a geometry a mathematician might have admired, triangles inside rectangles inside a long, patient rectangle of room. Within that shape something small moved, so fast and so slight that she doubted herself before she doubted the ceiling. She took a picture of nothing and, after a moment's thought, took another. Lenka had set a small air current ribbon on the bench near the back door. It hung perfectly at ease. She wrote "no significant draft" in her tablet. On the floorboards, the heads of nails winked, each one a tiny moon 40 years past useful. On a work table she found, under a sheet of browned paper, a book of needle samples sewn to a backing card. She called Rodek over and they labored through the gentle motions of lifting an old thing without breaking it. The needles were annotated in thin, precise script: Glovers, sailmakers, milliners. There was a blank space at the bottom where something small and slender had once been mounted and then removed. The string that should have tied it in place cut a clean trench into the card. "Take it," Rodek said. "Photograph the absence as you would the presence." Marek cleared his throat. "Sir." He hadn't spoken loudly, but the room listened for him and the sound went farther than he intended. Rodek joined him at the central bench where a nest of dolls lay in half-assembled intention. Torsos buttoned, limbs unstrung, hair waiting in twine skeins. Marek pointed to a jawline with a graphite trembling fingertip. "Look here. The stitches aren't just closing the mouth. They're..." He hesitated over the word. "Stacked. Like cords." Petra stepped in with the camera and took a close shot. The loops lay in neat sequence, then crossed to the opposite lip, then bound back. The thread sank and rose the way a melody falls and recovers. Petra's scalp prickled the way it does when a storm changes the pressure. She took another frame and later she would not be able to explain why the second was sharper than the first when she had stood so still for both. They moved as a small weather system through the room, each of them creating a lee for the others. They took samples. They bagged dust. They noted the way the smell of oil never quite left the air. Time combed itself straight. 1952 made way for 2110. The building seemed to adjust to their presence as a body adjusts to a splinter, irritated, then resigned, then quietly angry again when the nerve finds the intruder. At 23:52, Petra asked for the lights to be dimmed. "Just a minute," she said. "I want to see if the ceiling will show itself without glare." Lenka obliged, dialing the lamps down to a winter week imitation of moonlight. The darkness climbed the walls as if returning from an errand. Petra aimed the camera up and exhaled, syncing her heartbeat for steadiness. In the lowered light, the beams lost their hardness and became suggestions of beams. Between them, the air seemed to gather, to thicken, to take on the faint, almost gelatinous look of heated air over a road. "There," she said, and pressed the shutter. Something moved along the far truss, a quicksilver comma, a tremor at the edge of a line. It might have been a moth if moths were made of wire and intention. Petra pressed the shutter again and felt, for the first time since entering, something like dislike from the room. Not hostility, not yet, but the attention you reserve for a fly that has risked your food. "Midnight in 3, Lenka said to nobody in particular. They stood in the throb of their equipment and the minute that cities used to turn their coat from one day to the next. The building eased a long breath from between its boards. Somewhere in the infrastructure a pipe ticked with contraction. The ribbon on the bench flirted with motion and subsided. The second hand compounded the last few steps toward 12. When the hour broke, the needles answered. It was not loud. It was a dry, precise music like rain remembered by wood. Every tin of needles, every rank of them laid out on their flannel beds, gave a fractional tap, as if some minute hand had moved across their points and each had given a single acknowledgement. Then, a heartbeat later, they did it again. Marek flinched and knocked his shin against a drawer. Lenka's pen stopped moving. Petra lifted the camera half an inch and forgot, for a brief, humiliating instant, how to frame. "Stand still," Radek said softly. The tapping settled into a pattern. Not random, not quite regular. It wandered, then returned, the way a tune does when someone hums it from memory. Petra aimed at the tins and saw nothing but lids. She aimed at the ceiling and saw, to her hunted relief, only dark. She fired a burst of 3 shots and would later find blur in the first and the third, not the second. Motion where there had been none. A faint, eccentric halo around the beam ends as if the wood had been vibrating under sound too quiet to hear. From the door behind them came the smallest sound of being opened, though none of them had moved. The inner latch rattled without authority. They turned together like dancers made briefly competent by counting. "Check it," Radek said to Marek, and regretted it even as he said it, because he should have gone himself. Marek went because he was new and wanted to be old. He put a hand on the door and felt the cool of it, then the not cool, an animal warmth as if someone had placed a cheek against the wood from the other side. He took his hand away and it felt empty. He opened the door a fraction. The corridor beyond lay black and felt longer than it should have been. The needles tapped again, once close by. Marek turned his head. A tin on the nearest bench had migrated 3 centimeters without traveling. It had been there, now it was here with no mechanical history between. He set the evidence box down and, with the caution reserved for dangerous animals and holy relics, lifted the lid of the tin. The needles lay in perfect file. He stared at them until his eyes ached. Then one of them, a slender thing, almost a hair, twitched a distance so small the motion should be called theory rather than fact. He bent closer. He did not see the thread first. He felt it. A hair-thin touch across his upper lip, not pressure but intention. He recoiled and the brief contact became a quick, tidy nick. The pain was nothing. The meaning was more than he had to spare. He put his fingers to his mouth and they came away with the clean line of blood that a paper cut gives, except no paper could have cut so obediently to the curve of his mouth. Petra was there first, hand gentle on his wrist, camera forgotten, light finding the wound. Lenka pulled a sterile strip from her kit. "Hold still," she said, and her voice was exactly as it would have been in a kitchen with a careless child. The line across Marek's lip was so straight that it looked worked. You could almost see where a stitch might start, how easily one could follow another. Radek looked at the tin. He looked at the doll whose mouth lay nearest. He had the thought, appalling in its domesticity, that the room wanted to measure them. Measure the thickness of a lip, the compliance of skin, the distance between first puncture and second. He closed the tin and sealed it in a bag before he could change his mind. The tapping went on, a little more insistent now, as if they had been taught its terms and had yet to answer. "That's enough," he said. He did not raise his voice because raising your voice gives shape to fear and feeds it. "Pack what we have. We'll brief outside." Lenka wanted to argue in the name of protocol. Petra wanted 3 more shots and then 3 more. Marek wanted not to be the reason grown people left a room. The door behind them sighed again, or perhaps it was only the building shifting its weight, or perhaps something else entirely. Petra's camera beeped with the wheezy optimism of a machine that doesn't know it's unwelcome. They moved with decisive care, as if performing the steps of a ceremony whose priest had died without leaving notes. Evidence into bags, bags into cases, cases into hands. The light rose a notch and the needles quieted. Though quieted was the wrong word. They deferred. Outside, the rain had become a fine, busy fog that found every seam. The air smelled like wet brick and tin. Marek sat on the curb under the overhang and let Lenka strip his mouth with the tenderness of someone cross with the world and not with him. Petra scrolled through images she had not taken with quite enough care and stopped at one that made her stomach pull. A frame of the rafters where, in the upper right, the beam wore a thin flare like a knife-lit edge on. She marked it with a star and closed the viewer because looking again would not make her feel better. Radek stood with his notebook closed. The building watched them from its skin. "We go again," he said, which they all knew and none of them wanted as much as they wanted breath. "Tomorrow, with better ladders, with the acoustic kit. I want the tins catalogued by count and by weight." He felt for the old key in his pocket. His fingers traced its wards like a rosary and found no comfort there, only a plan. He looked at Marek's lip, at the straightness of that brief red seam, at the way the steri-strip made a pale bridge. He imagined a row of such bridges, smaller and smaller, a flock of white gulls descending a mouth. The thought made him angrier than the room had managed. Anger was a kind of warmth, and warmth was protection. He locked the door with the new key and then with the old out of a superstition he would not have admitted. The second lock took on the weight of his hand with a click that felt more intimate than any he had heard in the job. He pressed the wood once, the way you check that a sleeping child is breathing. Then he turned away and the others fell in beside him. Behind them, the workshop regarded the reinscribed boundary and, for now, agreed. The rain combed the street into order. The city made its old, difficult peace with night. They left with samples and photographs, and with a red, precise line across a young officer's lip to mark midnight's terms. Her room looked east over the tram lines. In the mornings, the glass wrote ladders of light across the blanket. But today the sky was the color of boiled linen and the tracks below were quiet. The girl kept the curtains half closed as if brightness hurt. She lay propped on pillows with a thin white strip stitched like a bridge across her upper lip where the surgeon had set the wound to heal. When she swallowed, her throat worked in brief, careful clicks, a mechanism newly suspicious of itself. Her name was Adela Konechna. She was 21, a literature student who had learned to translate terror into language before terror taught her that not everything could be turned. There was a clipboard on her lap, a cheap school one with a spring clip that had lost its spring. A black felt-tip pen lay beside her fingers. The nurse had given her a bell in case she needed them quickly, but she preferred to tap the pen against the board twice. The motion was brisk, efficient, as if she were answering a question to which she already knew the shape of the answer. Radek pulled a chair near the bed and sat with his notebook closed. He had learned that some people spoke more willingly when they didn't think they were being collected. He introduced himself and the others, Lenka at the foot of the bed, Petra by the window, her camera dark, Marek in the hall because he had asked to stay and Radek had said no. The nurse checked the 4, checked Adela's eyes with a small light that made her blink, and left. The door made a click that took its time dying away, like a sewing machine coasting to a stop. "You don't have to push," Radek said, and Adela cocked her head as if to say the words did not fit her. She put the board on her knees and wrote, the felt-tip letter form sturdy and upright. I want to. Her hand was left leaning, the strokes blunt at the end where the pen paused and lifted. She held the pen too tight, the way someone does who doesn't trust small tools not to betray them. Tell me about the night, he said. As much as you remember. If it was earlier than that, tell me that too. She wrote without hesitation, a teacher's calm block letters. My friends dared me to go in. I wanted a video. I liked the words on the drawers, the labels. She looked up to see if he understood what kind of person this confession named. He nodded. They were handsome labels, he said. The hand careful. She pressed lips that could not yet press. The strip tugged a little. She wrote again. Someone taught her that hand. Radek kept his eyes on her face as he asked the next question. What did you see that we haven't already seen? Her pen stalled for the first time. She twitched her fingers as if feeling the small scar the surgeon had left low on her palate. Then she wrote, a woman's hands. The pen sat above the page for a breath. Then, just hands. Doing what? He asked. Another stall, a long one. She set the pen down, lifted her right hand, and moved it in the air, a seamstress's gesture. Not the clumsy pantomime of someone who has only seen sewing in films, but the native economy of a person who has once done it 1,000 times. Thumb and forefinger pinched an invisible needle. The ring finger held the phantom thread in check. The palm turned with an old intelligence. She pulled once, twice, a third time, the tense tendons at her wrist flicking under her skin. Where were they? He said. Where in the room? Her hand made a small, slow orbit, the gesture of searching for a place to set down a cup in the dark. Everywhere. She looked at the window as if the answer might be written there. She wrote, above the beams, and by my face, like when your mother fixes your collar. The speed of the pen increased. Whatever she had blocked was beginning to step out. I heard a song, not melody like radio, a song that counts, loop/cinch/cross, and a voice behind me said, she paused, the felt tip making a dot that spread slightly. Hush, child, dolls don't speak. She had written the quotation marks with an odd care, as if they were charms. Radek didn't look at Petra because he didn't need to. He could feel her attention focus like light through a lens. What did the voice sound like? He asked. Age? Accent? Breath? Adela wrote, no mouth, only hands. The sound was in the bones of the table. She lifted the pen and tapped the board twice. You saw a face? He said, though she had already told him no. It was a way of testing the limits of no. She shook her head. Then she drew. For a minute she was all wrist and calibration, angles rehearsed by childhood. The sketch that emerged was not skillful in a decorative way. It was competent the way maps are. A figure seated at a bench, shoulders squared, head bowed. Where the face should have been, she drew a thimble, large as a helmet. The dimples clustered around the crown like a rash of tiny constellations. She darkened the perforations with the side of the pen until the shape became an absence rather than an object. The effect was strangely architectural, like a tower with arrow-slit windows. She added details, a seam of thread running from the thimble's rim down through the air, the suggestion of a needle tilted just so. A spool suggested by two imperfect circles. The hands she rendered first, tendons, the slight bluntness at the fingertips of someone who has pushed through cloth without looking. On the ring finger of the right hand, she made a small oval and darkened it. Not a ring, Radek thought. A pinch of shadow where skin had been worn smooth by years against metal. He let her finish. He had learned it was unwise to interrupt someone assembling their own ghost. How did it touch you? He said at last. And this time she closed her eyes before she answered, as if to spare both of them. She wrote with the slow precision of dictation. Not like a knife, like a tape measure. Across the mouth first, measuring how far, how thick, how much skin to pull. Inside the throat it felt like thread drinking. She paused and then wrote smaller, as if lowering her voice could lower the fact itself. When I tried to say stop, the thread went faster. Petra made a noise that could have been breath or censure or the cough of a machine that will not turn over. Lenka's hand, which had been still against the footboard, moved once in a smoothing gesture and stopped. "Did you see the spool?" Roddick asked. The pen wrote an O with the impatience of someone who has been asked whether they saw the wind. Then, after a beat, "It doesn't need one." She underlined that as if the line itself could keep the truth in place. "Did your friends?" he began, and she was already shaking her head. She wrote, "I went back alone. The stream cut. They ran. I thought the quiet was safer." She looked at the pen as if it had betrayed her to write that last sentence. She pressed the felt tip to the corner of the board until it made a small black sun, then circled it once, twice, and drew a line toward the edge as if giving the sun a path to follow away. "What drew you to the labels?" he asked, because sometimes what seems indulgent turns out to be architecture. "The handwriting. It was a kind hand, careful." She hesitated, then wrote, "I trusted it." He looked down at his closed notebook and then at her board where her perfect blunt letters stacked like bricks. He thought of the sample card Lenka had found, the blank space where a needle had once been mounted, the trench from the missing tie. He thought of the air over the ceiling beams thickening like heat and of the line across Marek's lip, straight enough to pretend it had always been there. A hand had taught a room to remember. "Do you know the song?" he asked. "Can you write it?" She frowned. The pen hovered over the board. She made a series of small curves that were not letters, not numbers, not the kind of marks a child makes when imitating writing. They were loops of even spacing, each loop crossed at an interval, each cross staggered from the last, a chain of discipline. She stopped and held the pen away as if the line might go on without her. Counted. It was proud of how it counted. "Do you know the words?" Petra asked, gently, as if she could separate melody from harm. Adela shook her head. Then, after a moment, wrote, "Old words. Child words. A rhyme grandfathers hum when they can't sleep." Her face changed briefly with the expression of someone who has tried a locked door and found it double-bolted. Roddick took the drawing from the board with 2 fingers and set it on the bedside table. He would have it photographed later, catalogued with the care of a relic. For now, it needed to sit near the person who had made it. He slid a narrow box from his satchel and opened it so she could see. A photograph of the needle sample card, a print of the rafters with the knife-lit flare, a vacuum-sealed sachet of dust gathered from the bench. He set them out without commentary, the way a priest sets vessels on a cloth. Her eyes went to the photograph of the card. She put her finger on the blank. Lightly. She looked at Roddick and shook her head once. The universal sign for that is not a mistake. Then she touched the printed flare at the corner of the beam and flinched, as if the paper were unexpectedly warm. She withdrew her hand and wiped the finger unconsciously on the blanket. "She wasn't sitting there," she wrote, and drew an arrow not to the bench, not to the photograph, but to the space between them, as if that was where the seamstress lived. In the interval between record and witness where things that don't want to be named make their home. He found himself smiling without humor. "Of course she wasn't," he said. "Of course she knows to stay in the distance between." She looked at him with the relief of someone who has been allowed to be exact. "Adela," he said, "was there anything else? Anything you smelled? The room felt like? Anything your hand did that you didn't ask it to do?" She wrote laundry and underlined it. "Ironed cotton." Then, the hands were tired. And then, smallest of all, in letters that wanted to hide. She was pleased. He closed his eyes for one heartbeat. When he opened them, he nodded as if she had told him the weather. He stood, not to end it but to let her see that he would not keep her any longer in the place where memory gnaws. He thanked her. Lenka thanked her. Petra, before she could stop herself, put the tips of her fingers to the drawing as if checking a child's forehead for heat and said, "It's good." Which was a foolish thing to say about a map of harm, but also true. At the door, Adela tapped the pen, and Roddick turned back. She had written 3 last words, and their plainness lifted the hair along his arms. It was old. He carried that with him down the corridor. In the stairwell, he stopped and wrote 3 words of his own in the notebook he had not opened beside her. Clara, 1923. Choir. The letters looked too dark, as if the ink had been steeped in something metallic. He closed the book and felt, For the first time since the case began, the impression that he was not only dealing with a criminal fact but with a historical argument. One the city had lost and then tried to forget. Some doors, he thought, do not lead into rooms. They lead straight into the century that made them. Outside, the trams had found their noise again. He let the sound pour through him, human and shameless. On the way back to the car, he bought a paper from a kiosk he never used and, while the vendor counted his change, looked at the headlines populating the day with a manageable inventory of dangers. It was good to read names that came with addresses and charges. It was good to remember that some stories end in courts. This one would not. The drawing of the thimble-faced seamstress went into evidence. The phrase, "Hush, child, dolls don't speak," went into Rodek's bones. He left the hospital convinced the workshop silence belonged to someone with a history, and that the city had once tried to stitch her out of it. Cities keep two ledgers, the one you can audit and the one the century writes in its own hand. Rodek spent a day walking between them. At the municipal archive, the clerk with the slow cough produced a stack of bound folios that remembered more than they disclosed. The property register showed the building in Zizkov as light manufacture, textile adjunct until 1919. Then a gap. Then a stamp that had bled its purple into the paper like an old bruise. Reviewed. No name. No tax rolls for the relevant years. Rodek turned the pages with the care of someone handling a brittle alibi. Try trade licenses, the clerk suggested, his finger already finding the drawer. The metal squealed like a scolded hinge. There it was, written in the polite exactness of an imperial form long outlived by its empire. Havelkova, Clara, Seamstress. Dolls and repairs. Date of issue, 1911. Renewal through 1918. The signature, small and steady, sat like a stitch at the end of a line. Rodek made a note of the address attached to her early license. It matched the workshop. He asked for union minutes. He was handed a ledger with edges like toast. The entries around 1920 grew stingy. Someone, somewhere, had developed a habit of using fewer words when more would have served. Even so, the pages could not help leaking. Petition re. Hours for girls in Havelkova shop. Complaint. Hair handling unsanitary. Request to audit materials stated as sinew. The word looked ashamed of itself on the paper, as if it had meant thread, and only later remembered its origin. He checked shipping records. Thread, yes, cotton where it could be found, linen when it could not. Hair by the kilo, swept from salons and bundled in newspapers, a practice old enough to predate disgust. And then, as the shortages deepened and the country learned to repair itself with what it could salvage, invoices for catgut. Not for surgery, not for music, at least not as declared. In the margins of one bill a clerk had doodled a line of small loops crossed at intervals, the idle music of a bored hand. Rodek felt the childish urge to put his finger on the loops and count them. The personnel ledgers were worse. Names in and out, most of them women, a few boys apprenticed to sweep and prepare glue. In the year 1922, the column destination after separation began to favor a single word: America. But the passport office records did not rise to meet the ledger's optimism. The names did not appear on ship manifests. They did not appear in parish farewells. Families wrote complaints, and the complaints went to ground. Where the minutes recorded the wailing hinge of public grief, later hands had pasted slips of paper that, when removed, left behind pale rectangles of silence. Rodek took his small pile, license copies, union extracts, a poor photograph of the workshop exterior with women in their coats dispersing after a shift, and walked 2 streets over to the newspaper office that kept its dead on microfilm. The reels gave him advertisements: dolls mended for Christmas, discount on lashes, and then a flurry of smaller, more frightened text. Warehouse guard injured, disturbance at Zizkov factory, police inquiry continues. One column halted mid-sentence where the film itself had been scored. The surviving half read, officers struck by needlework of singular, and stopped as if the century had bitten the ribbon. He sought the parish registers not because he had patience for piety, but because parishes paid attention to departures and arrivals. The priest was new, but the sacristy was old, and a box labeled confessions. Anonymous, 1920 to 1924, kept under the stairs reminded Rodek that anonymity always leaves fingerprints. There were slips, names clipped, dates intact, in a tumbling hand. "Forgive me, Father, for I hate the sound of sewing, and I took hair not my own, and I heard them in the floor." One poor scrap had been written by someone who did not trust letters, the lines of her pen making loops crossed at tidy, repeating intervals until the page grew too dark to accept ink. Afternoons were for the registry of deaths. The column that should have held certificates for injuries at the workshop held two oblique entries, both in the summer of 1923, officer incapacitated, cause, injury to oral cavity, sergeant, same. Rodek copied the names and went looking for next of kin. One grandson answered his door with a terrier at his heel and a memory stuffed with family folklore. His grandfather, he said, had never whistled after that night. He had not been physically unable. He had simply lost the habit of putting sound through his mouth. "Dolls?" the old man said, and his laugh was a flat thing. "We had no money for dolls. We had girls, and we tried not to have girls disappear." He fetched a biscuit tin of papers and laid them out like a diviner. There were two photographs Rodek had not seen, the workshop floor taken from the door in a blade of winter light, and a portrait of a woman labeled in pencil K. Havelkova, 1915. In the floor picture, the benches held still as furniture. Every woman in the frame had her head bent, hands working, shoulders disciplined into narrowness. In the portrait, Clara sat bolt upright, the lines of her face carved by long attention. She wore a plain dress and, in lieu of ornament, a thimble on her right ring finger. The thimble shone a little too brightly for ordinary use. "Pretty?" the grandson offered. Rodek resisted the easy agreement. The mouth was level. The eyes were something else. He had seen people in interrogation rooms who wore that expression when they had already decided to outlast you. He found one last ledger that the archive clerk produced with a half-smile, the universal expression of a fellow conspirator in benign crimes. It was a small register maintained by the city's inspection office, the sort of book that would not survive a zealous purge because it was too dull to count. It had stamps about fire exits and ventilation that read now like prayers. It also had, slotted like a pinhead, an observation from June 1923. Basement sealed by order. Access prohibited. Plan amended. The amended plan showed no basement, but the original plan had gone missing. "Who ordered the seal?" Rodek asked. The clerk produced an ink pad stamped out of pigment so old it could only make the idea of a stamp. The impression read, Capecchi. It was a policeman's name, fallen out of the roster between wars. The file that should have told him why had been chewed at the edges by mice, and where the center should have been there was only the paler rectangle of an absence that had not bothered to disguise itself. Even so, a three-line memo from late that summer limped into readability. Raid suspended, casualties, evidence retained, further action, then the tear. The handwriting was small and defensive, as if the letters themselves expected to be called to account. Rodek asked for gossip. He got it. An old seamstress who had worked in a different shop remembered a girl transferred for speed, meaning she could close a run of mouths in the time others took to choose thread. "Clara?" the woman said, and her fingers, without thinking, made a pinch and draw motion that set something hard moving under the skin of her wrist. They said she sang numbers to herself. Not lyrics, counts. She said you could teach your hands to sleep and keep working if you gave them a rhythm. The seamstress spat, not out of superstition, out of the practical contempt of one professional for another who had fallen in love with her own method. "And the hair," she said. She liked hair. She said it remembered. It did, in a way. Hair keeps a diary of where a body has been. If Clara believed in a kind of accounting that the city did not, perhaps she had kept books in the medium she trusted. Rodek imagined drawers labeled hair and lashes and sinew, the good careful hand on the tags, and the belief that order is a magic stronger than luck. There was a story about silver wire, not the soft, fat kind used for costume jewelry. The hand-drawn, fragile kind that Raymond Chandler might have described had he ever troubled Prague. A jeweler on Dluha Street complained in a letter that his apprentice had been buying wire from another source and undercutting him. The letter did not say whose. It did say that the wire's temper was off, too alive, too whippy for charms or chains. He disliked the feel of it between his fingers. He wrote, a perverse impression that it would follow a seam if you set it to one and did not permit it to leave. Roddick read until the hour turned thin. The city that had birthed the workshop had been hungry, newly constituted, glamourless. Women worked because they had to. Children were loud unless they had been taught otherwise. The newspapers turned their faces toward the flag and missed more than they could afford. Behind all this, a person had believed that you could correct an entire world with enough care and the right tools. Why not demolish it? Petra asked that evening as the four of them looked again at the photograph of the benches lit by knife weather. After the raid, after the casualties. Demolition is loud, Roddick said. Sealing is quiet. Quiet pleases the public and economies the court. And if you seal the wrong thing? Lenka asked. If you seal a lesson, he said, you teach it to last. He laid the amended plan of the building on Lenka's case and drew the possible lines with his finger. The stove had a flue that did not behave like a flue. Its route to the chimney jogged too hard and then was lost. The joists recorded weight where no one walked. The sound, when Merrick had tapped the floor with his baton that first night, had come back a shade too hollow 1 meter in from the central bench. The original plan says basement, Petra said. The amended plan says none, Roddick said. The inspection note says sealed. The union complaint about hours for girls below stairs says there is a below, Lenka finished. He did not say what else it might say, that whoever had done the sealing had done it from the inside. The thought chimed like cutlery in a drawer. He went home that night to a kitchen that had never learned to hold warmth the way he liked it. He boiled water and poured it down the drain for the sound and the steam, both human comforts. He dreamed of loops and crossings, of rows of mouths that were not mouths but clefts, of a woman who believed she could conduct silence if she wrote it down carefully enough. He woke with the thin taste of old iron on his teeth and an intention that felt, as intention sometimes does, like hunger. Morning returned him to the ledger. He took the blandest piece of information he had, a date, and worried it. 1923 had not been kind to anyone. The economy lurched. Men who called themselves men turned into men who called themselves something else when they wanted less work for more pay. The city learned a new anthem by singing it until some of them believed it. In the cracks, someone like Clara could persuade herself that order was mercy. Roddick had met people like that. They were dangerous when satisfied and lethal when thwarted. He held the photograph of her and covered, with his thumb, the thimble on her finger. Without the thimble, the portrait softened in a way that made him uneasy. The pinprick dimples on the metal had nested like a constellation. To remove them was to take stars out of a map. By noon, the team had reconvened at the workshop. The rain had scoured the street clean and left behind a smell like wet tin. Roddick carried the amended plan and the ghost of the original in his head. He set the plan on the nearest bench and anchored it with evidence tins. Lenka knelt with a carpenter's humility and ran her knuckles over the floorboards. Listening, Petra unpacked an old surveyor's staff, because glass and wood can tell you things that instruments forget to hear. Here, Merrick said, not eager, not triumphant, only certain. A seam lay like a faint smile in the wood, parallel to the bench, disguised by a century of grime. Someone had once sanded it so diligently that the grain had learned to lie. Lenka brushed away the dust and turned her head to put her ear to the board. Sound came up, a bass the building had been repressing out of principle. The inspection officer wrote sealed, Roddick said. Not filled. Which means air, Lenka murmured, and air means breath and breath means. She did not finish because the thought, once said aloud, would have asked too much of all of them. They pried at the seam not with crowbars, too dramatic, too eager, but with a conservator's tools. The first plank lift was reluctant. The second release was sudden enough to lean them into each other. A thin coil of smell stepped out, the way folded cloth releases the ghost of starch. Iron, too clean, not bloody. The old coin scent of water that has consented to sit with metal. Petra lowered her light and made the camera behave. The divide opened on black that was not empty but crowded with the idea of objects. the sense you get of furniture in a room you've always navigated in the dark. The beam found the top step. The step was worn in the middle in a way that only feet can teach wood, a small cupping that admits time. Dust motes blinked and, at their far edge, something thinner than dust moved as if it were too delicate to be called motion. Rodek stood and accepted that his breath had turned shallow. He put his hand to the jamb, the way a man does before entering a church where his mother has taught him to behave. He did not descend. Not yet. The city had told him once, in his oldest training, that permission precedes action. The building did not give it, but it did not deny. He marked the seam on his plan the way you mark a door on a map drawn for someone who will have to use it in the dark. He looked at Lenka and saw her counting tools. He looked at Merrick and saw him unconsciously touch the steri-strip on his healing lip. He looked at Petra and saw her angle the camera to hold the top stair in a small, obedient frame. "Seal it for tonight," he said. "We go below with an air monitor and a second exit." And with the knowledge that this was meant to be closed. "By whom?" Merrick asked. "By someone who thought silence could be installed like a fixture," Rodek said. "By someone who mistook the absence of sound for safety." He replaced the plank with the same care with which he'd lifted it, the care of a man tucking a child into bed in a house that is not his own. The seam looked back at him with maddening innocence. The amended plan said there was no basement. The floor said there was. By dusk, the team had found the hidden seam and the first steps into the dark. Stairs descending into a space the city had tried to subtract from its own memory. They went back in daylight because daylight makes a promise even to basements. The street had the rinsed look of early afternoon after a thin rain. Rodek arrived with the acoustic kit in a battered case. A portable air monitor that chirped like a patient bird, 2 respirators in their bags, headlamps, chalk, and a coil of rescue line white as laundry pulled from a mangle. Lenka had requisitioned a set of conservator's levers instead of crowbars. Petra had packed extra batteries and a small digital recorder that was, in her words, narrow-minded enough to notice what we won't. Merrick had not asked to stay upstairs. He collected the coil with the chastened conscientiousness of someone who had learned a new respect for thin metal. The steri-strip that bridged his lip had turned the color of old paper. When he touched it, he did so with the faintly ritual gesture of a man checking a boundary. The seam yielded more quickly the second time. Boards rose with a soft complaint, as if would resented admitting it had ever been useful in 2 directions. The first stair showed its cup where feet had trained it. The second had the white bloom of old damp. Rodek set the air monitor sensor nose just beyond the hatch. Numbers jittered and settled. "Breathable," he said, and the relief was ordinary enough to be funny. Lenka chalked the hatch with a sandbag. Petra clipped the recorder to the strap of her vest with its mouth open and its red light small as a drop of blood. Merrick paid the rescue line out and made a hitch around the central bench leg, which had held an earlier century's weight and would hold theirs. The temperature changed at the 6th step. It was not only cooler, it was more exact. Air that has been sealed keeps better account of itself. The smell came next, clean iron, starch, and something like old lavender pressed into drawer paper. The beam from Rodek's lamp folded over the bottom stair and broke across space. They were in a room the plan had denied. Long, narrow, the scale of a corridor magnified until it became a hall. The ceiling was lower than they wanted, lined with joists thick enough to take a man's weight if a man were fool enough to test them. Along the left wall ran cages. Iron squares gone the color of wet rust, stacked too high like crude pigeonholes. Their doors had hasps, not locks. Inside were shapes that read as inventory until the eye insisted on the nouns. Plaster molds for heads and hands, armatures with finger joints drilled to take wire, bins of buttons sorted by the pitiless categories of color and size. And, in 2 of the bottom crates, among curls of paper and burlap, what a field catalog might call bone fragments. They were small, irregular, white as moths' wings. Merrick knelt and photographed them without comment, the camera's shutter making the sound of a pawned second-hand clock. Across the room, against the right-hand wall, stood a rank of benches much like those above, but stripped of comfort. These had no mugs rings, no scars from scissors. They had been sanded to an almost moral smoothness. Over them hung something that made all of them pause at once and hold their hands slightly away from their bodies, as if they had been told not to touch a painting. Silver threads crossed the space in taut lines, anchor to anchor, from post to joist, from hook to hook, in a geometry so tight and patient that the room seemed to have been wrapped by a giant with a gift for parcels. The threads were not web. They were wire drawn so fine it bullied the air into shining. They were strung at different heights, some at the level of a throat, some at the level of an eye, some nearer knees and wrists. Where the light fell, the strands burned a colorless white. Where shadow touched them, they vanished and then, with the slightest change of angle, flashed like a hair in sunlight. "Don't move quickly," Roddick said, and then realized he had spoken too late because everyone had already chosen slowness. Lenka raised her hand and traced the nearest strand without touching. Her finger stopped an inch shy of it, as if heat were coming off the wire. "Static?" she murmured. The hair along the back of her hand lifted by fractions. Petra angled her lens and swore softly when the autofocus hunted and failed, cozened into thinking there was nothing to see. She took the camera to manual and focused not on the wire but on the empty air so the wire would appear when it chose. Roddick followed the lines with his lamp until they converged at a bench raised on blocks in the center of the floor. On the bench sat a sewing machine whose brand badge had been polished so often its letters had been persuaded to stay bright while the world dimmed around them. It was an old pedal machine with a flywheel large enough to remember inertia. The belt had been replaced at least twice. The last leather loop had cracked and been supplemented with a short run of wire links as neat as rosary knots. In front of the machine sat a figure. From a distance it looked like a child grown badly, light, jointed wrong, patient in the way only made things can be patient. Up close it resolved into a mannequin assembled from pieces that should not have liked each other but had been taught to agree. A head made from a mold half-cast and papered over with book pages so old the print had turned the color of tea. A torso constructed of wooden stays and thin ribs, arms joined with twisted wire at elbow and wrist. There were no legs. The skirt of a dress, stiff with starch, hid the precipitous drop to the bench. Where hands should have been there were hands, though hands with flattened nails, the skin hollow at the knuckles, the pads shiny from uses that had nothing to do with touch. Roddick's first terrible thought was not superstition. It was craftsmanship. Someone had made this with attention. Someone had taught it what its posture meant even when no one watched. The figure sat with its back straight and its chin inclined in approval. A thimble, heavy, ridged, too large to wear, had been set over the place where a face should be. The dye marks on the metal caught the light and squinted it into constellations. Silver thread coiled from beneath the thimble's rim, ran in a single line to the machine's needle, and from there out into the room, where it separated and multiplied over the benches until it met the anchors that made the ceiling a map. Merrick stopped breathing. He could feel the seam at his mouth trying to align with the nearest taut line. He put 2 fingers there as if to remind his face of his intentions. "We document first," Roddick said, "because rules make their own warmth. No touch unless necessary. No cut without 2 witnesses and a photograph." "Cut," Lenka said, not incredulous, not eager, only asking for the shape of the plan overtly enough that the room could hear it. "If we need an exit," Roddick said. They began the work that auditors do in churches, measuring sanctity with a tape and numbering it with chalk. Lenka tied bright tags to the lowest wires and formed a small path like a child's game through a string maze. Petra photographed every 7th anchor point full frame and then in detail. Then, suspicious of the way perspective could lie, she took a slate and wrote distances with her own hand as if the numbers would be more faithful if they understood who had brought them into the world. Roddick drew the space, as he always did, 2 rectangles, cross-hatching for benches, circles for cages, and then the lines, each one a small refusal to admit the world could be simpler than this. The air moved in small, deliberate ways. When Petra's sleeve brushed the house-fine shadow of a strand, the wire thrummed, not audibly, but with a pressure that wrapped the bone and informed it of the strand's temper. When Lenka leaned her weight away from a cluster of lines to reach an anchor near the floor, the wire nearest her hand tightened, as if the room disapproved of intentional imbalance. Merrick, in his corner with the bone fragments and the neat tray of cotton swabs, felt the peculiar shame of someone intruding on a drawer where another person kept their relics. He tried not to anthropomorphize, then found he preferred anthropomorphizing to the alternative. "Listen," Petra said, and they did. The recorder on her strap voided the silence into numbers and kept count. At first, there was only the ordinary palette of a sealed room. Their breath, the small whip of wire against air, the mousefoot of dust dropping into a new home. Then, in the space that sits exactly between sound and its idea, something like a melody collected itself. It was not a tune so much as the ghost of a tune, the implication of one. The rhythm came first, a slow, demonstrative counting that turned out not to be numbers. The counts were motions. 2 loops somewhere on the right, a cinch in front of them, across a beat later at head height near the cage wall. The recorder's light steadied and the display drew a narrow city of peaks and valleys, as if the wires were talking in the blunt syntax of tension. "That's not possible," Lenka said, and then added, because she was disciplined, "in the way we expect." The curve of the figure's fingers changed, the smallest give in the tendons, the sort of motion you could argue about for the rest of your life and never agree until one day you found yourself using your hands the same way. The thumb flexed as if to hold a loop down. The forefinger lifted and pointed toward the needle, made the old familiar dip and pulled. "Petra," Radek said, and the one word meant photograph it without permitting it to become spectacle. She did, hating her own heart for betraying her into speed. The first frame was blurred. The second was brave. In the second, the hand was still. In the first, the wire at the wrist had moved barely enough to mark motion, and mark it in such a place that no one could later say with any confidence that she had seen a trick of shadow. Radek angled his lamp into the shelter under the bench. The floor beneath the machine wore a neat scatter of cuttings, as tailors' floors do. Useless ends, knots trimmed off, a mean mat of waste that had not been swept because the person who worked here had valued rhythm over cleanliness. Except the cuttings were not thread. They were wire. They curled and glinted like the shells of tiny organisms bleached to metal. He wanted to laugh in horror at the thought that wire could fray. He wanted not to imagine the consequences of an object that learned to behave like something soft and persuaded soft things to behave like it. "Bone?" he said to Merrick, who had been kneeling at the cages with the flat patience of function. "Fragments," Merrick said. "Mostly long bone ends. Small. Some finger phalanges, I think." His voice trailed off because saying hands aloud felt like a provocation. "And molds, sir. Face molds. Many mouths." He held up one plaster negative, the oval where a child's mouth would sit, pulled into a little O by a thumb. The impressions of lips translated into cavities looked carnivorous. He put it down with more respect than he had given anything in months. Radek drew a square around the central bench in his sketch and marked it with an X. "This was meant to be center," he said. "And these," he nodded toward the wires, "were meant to be audience. Or choir," Petra said, the word she had pulled from Adela's board rising of its own strength. They reached a rhythm in their work. Lenka moved along the walls with a soft pencil, numbering the anchors. 1A, 1B, 1C according to walls. Petra moved slower, notating light that shifted as if it had opinions. Merrick joked once and heard his joke die, so did not joke again. The recorder ticked minutes into their pockets. Radek's air monitor made its small comfort noise, still breathable. It changed at the 12th minute past the hour. The wire that ran from beneath the thimble to the machine's needle tightened. Not much, a fraction of a fraction, and the flywheel clicked forward one notch. The pedal depressed by the depth of a breath. The needle descended and rose, with no cloth to pierce, and made the soft noise of something remembering purpose. Lenka flinched and then, as if angry at herself for flinching, took one deliberate step nearer to the figure and examined the linkage at the ankle where no ankle was. Wire jumped there or wanted to. It had been wound around the joint with ugly ingenuity. "This isn't a motor," she said. "There's no current. This is stored tension," Radek said, "and gravity, and something that enjoys being allowed to do what it knows." The flywheel ticked forward again. Obediently, the needle kissed air. The thread from beneath the thimble paid out by the smallest length, then retreated, as if reconsidering generosity. Regina, an aunt from his childhood, had owned a clock with a pendulum that once, twice, then not again, had swung without being touched. This felt like that. Petra, who had been holding her breath, let it go. The recorder caught the exhale and, as it did so, also caught something else. The faintest melismatic hum, the suggestion of a lullaby sung too low for ears and just right for wire. Later, when they boosted the file and shaved its noise, they would hear syllables a child in Prague would know issued in the voice of metal. Hagage, ninge, not words so much as pressures, loop, cinch, cross-hiding where lyrics should be. For now, they only felt the hum as attention gathering at their eardrums. Enough, Radek said. He was not yet frightened. He was angry again, and anger cleared a path where fear would have built a fence. We have what we came for. We know the shape of it. We do not let it teach us its schedule. They backed out along the path Lenka had charted with tags. The wires allowed it, but allowed it like a host who means to be remembered for their generosity. At the foot of the steps, Radek turned and took one last look across the room. The mannequin sat in its correctness, hands serene, thimble faced toward nothing. The flywheel had stopped. The thread ran cleanly out and did not sag. He thought of Adela's drawing and of the small oval she had darkened on the ring finger, the place where metal had worn skin smooth. He thought of how long one has to work to earn such a mark. Upstairs, air was a gift again. Each floorboard took their weight as if permission meant pleasure. Lenka pulled the hatch shut with the tender violence of someone closing a wounded thing. They set evidence on the benches in small judicial rows. Radek dated his sketch. Petra labeled the recordings twice out of superstition that pretended to be procedure. Marek stuck his hands in his pockets and pulled them out when he felt wire that wasn't there. Radek called the captain from the quietest corner and said what needed to be said in a vocabulary that would do in a report. Hidden level located, hazards present, evidence of metal threads under tension, potential biohazard, request temporary reseal pending controlled removal. The captain asked 2 questions with the emphasis required to sound like oversight. Radek answered both and added one voluntary sentence. Sealing is a safety measure, not solution. The line was careless, and he knew it as soon as he heard himself. Sealing would be taken for solution by people who needed the comfort. He hung up and turned to the team. We close it. We call the city engineer. We log custody and we sleep. No heroics. No favors. He hesitated. And no talking to the press. He said it not because he thought they would, but because saying it set a boundary the day could respect. They sealed with a neatness that would have pleased anyone who respects what doors do. Screws went in with their heads aligned. The seam disappeared under dust that was not entirely an illusion. Lenka wrote sealed, date in her small print along the skirting board where no one would see it unless they were in on the joke that time is. Radek posted a notice on the outer door with the officious vocabulary of those who must forbid. Structural hazard. Entry prohibited. By order. Language makes a sort of fence, too. They slept or tried. The city held their rest in the old cupped palm it reserves for men and women who work at the edge of what it is willing to acknowledge. Petra dreamed of measuring tapes that licked over her face and woke with the taste of metal in her mouth and a certainty that the recorder would have more courage than she did. Lenka dreamed of bolts with the wrong threads that nonetheless married themselves to nuts and held. Marek dreamed of bone that wanted to remember gloves. Radek did not dream. He lay on his back and examined the ceiling as if it were a plan, tracing with his eyes the route of a flue that did not properly behave like a flue. By mid-morning, before the engineer had returned his call, the story was online. It was not their story at first glance. It was a 600-word piece on a crime blog maintained by a journalist with perfect eyebrows and a tolerance for threats. The headline was precise in the way imprecise things sometimes are. Silent workshop hides silver web. Police seal basement. What are they afraid of? The accompanying photograph was grainy, the way a thing shot through a crack is grainy. It showed wire like rain held still. It showed the corner of a bench. It showed the base of the sewing machine's flywheel and enough of the figure to look like a human seated at work. The comments multiplied like barbs. Cult, performance art, police hoax, old women's gossip, dolls don't speak, LOL. One commenter slowed the photograph and drew arrows to what he said were bone collections, and did not bother to spell the word right. Petra sent the link to Radek with a single word, sorry, though she had not been the leak. Lenka sent the words we were seen and then deleted them because it mattered less who had seen than what had been taught to look. Merrick typed I didn't and stopped because the sentence was too small beside the fact of the photograph. Radek read the piece twice and then again, 2 slow circuits as if he were a hand learning a seam. The photograph was taken from a vantage they had not used. It was from the descending stair, through the wires, with the camera held low and unwisely. Someone had come after them or had been there when they were and known how to keep quiet. He remembered the door sighing when no one had put a hand on it. He remembered the caps of nails blinking like small moons. He remembered that the city was a maze of adjacency and that sometimes people slept nearer to you than you could bear. He called the captain and weathered the iron patience of a man who expected to be blindsided on a Friday. He called the engineer and said, "Now!" He called the clerk with the cough at the archive and said nothing because there was nothing to say. But the call said, "We are in company." He called no journalist because journalists do not like being called except with the things that make their stories better. By afternoon, a second piece went up with a line of text that quoted no one and told too much. Recorder captures check Lullaby Underground, audio. Someone had either heard them talk about the recorder or had a source they had not imagined. The clip was low, the kind of low that makes your stereo think it is broken. If you knew the song, you could tell yourself you heard Hajj, Ninj under the wire hum. If you did not, you could still be taught to feel a count. Radek printed the article and smoothed it with the side of his hand as if straightening cloth before a cut. "Seal it again," he had said last night. He had sealed it. The city had unsealed it the way cities do, by looking, by guessing, by wanting a story that belonged to everyone. He closed his notebook and opened it on a fresh page. He wrote without haste. Reseal inadequate. Need plan that is not a lid. He resisted the shape of the next thought and wrote it anyway. If we shut it without undoing it, it will go where shut things go, side streets. Mouths. Songs. The hatch was back under screws. The notice hung straight on the door. But the photograph of the silver web had already taught the city a new word for fear, and the link to a thin, whispering lullaby was moving phone to phone. Radek ordered the basement sealed again, then understood with a tired clarity that sealing was only ever a delay. The first body did not look like a message. It looked like the kind of administrative cruelty cities inflict on their own. A man in a stairwell between 2 floors, slumped neatly as if he had sat down to tie his shoe and forgotten to get up again. He was the warehouse watchman who had tended the block adjacent to the workshop for 31 years, the one who had told Radek, with faint pride, that he could tell the hour by the weight of the air at night. His mouth was sewn shut in a spiral so tight the skin had blanched around it. The paramedics cut the outer thread and found another coil beneath, finer, traveling inward as if the mouth were a tunnel the city had failed to maintain. When they opened the airway, wire rose soft as exhalation. By noon, it had a headline anyway. The first piece called it a ritual killing, and then the second called it a copycat of a ritual killing, and by evening the word ritual had been laid to rest by a third article that said it was a hoax and a fourth that said the hoax had killed a man. Radek went to the morgue because the morgue was an honest room. Dr. Svoboda met him in an apron that had once been white. She pulled the sheet back with the care people reserved for their own hair. The watchman's face had been cleaned to a calm. The lip showed the ring of punctures where the spiral had passed. The faint, slick glimmer at the skin's edge could have been ointment. It was not. Silver, she said. Not pure. The impurities match your other sample. Cause? Radek asked. Obstruction, she said. If you want the ordinary version. She gestured with her chin toward the tray. A glass dish held a coil of wire drawn thinner than a hair and coiled tighter than a watch spring. It looked like something a jeweler would keep in a bottle as a reminder of patience. Tracheal lumen packed, she said. Not all at once. The lining shows microabrasions as if it went in slowly, turning as it traveled. I don't know how to say slowly in a report without being laughed at, so I will say gradually. Radek thought of thread drinking, the phrase Adela had written with such blunt clarity. Gradually, he said, and from within. She nodded. There's a bruise at the palate, she said. A small one, like a tool pressed there. She hesitated, then placed 2 fingers against her own soft palate and pushed, gently, as if testing a door. Like this. He looked away because people touching the architecture of their own bodies made him feel like a thief. The second body was a girl with a pushchair. She had been found in the tunnel between stations at museum, seated on the bench with the kind of posture you forgive new mothers for. The child was fine, screaming, which in a certain calculus counts as a variety of fine. The woman's lips had been sealed in a spiral that glittered like condensation. She had judged herself well enough to keep her head tilted to maintain airflow. The cut came swiftly and left a mouth that would not speak again without a fight. Someone had filmed the stroller wheels tapping the station tiles and posted it with music that tried to tell people how to feel. The comments taught themselves a new word for dread. Seamstress, someone wrote, and the word adhered. By evening she had a full name, the Seamstress of Silence. By the third body, the papers had adopted voices. Sober, mocking, concerned, arch. By the fourth, the government called Rodek's captain and asked whether they had considered the reputational damage of allowing an urban legend to grow in an election year. The captain said they had considered the damage of allowing citizens' mouths to be sewn shut and had decided to rank that above reputation. The official on the other end said the two were not mutually exclusive. Rodek stood outside his superior's office and counted the tiles. The CCTV became a kind of theater. People learned to watch the screens the way their grandparents had learned to watch the skies. In an office corridor in Carlin, a camera recorded a copy paper box sitting, innocent, beside a shredder. Then a flicker, a shine the shape of a falling drop, then static. The recording stopped 3 seconds before the timecode reached midnight and resumed 3 minutes after, with a janitor discovering a man seated and no longer part of the office. In a tram at Letna, a lens captured passengers' eyes all at once, turning to a window and focusing on nothing. If you slowed the frame to the point where it became its own hallucination, you could see a filament cast a line against the glass like a hair on a pillow. Lenka stood in the dark beside the evidence rack and watched a loop of a hallway in the municipal archive. The cough of the clerk who had helped Rodek rattled through the microphone, then softened. He strode into frame with a stack of forms, put them down, and pressed his fingers to his upper lip as if to feel whether he had remembered to shave. A glint appeared between his fingers and the skin in the web of his hand flinched. He looked at the space where his hand had been and then, with the puzzled obedience of someone being led away from a thought, sat down. The camera lost signal. When it came back, an assistant who had not yet learned to distrust rooms found him and dropped her clipboard. The forms went everywhere. Lenka closed the file, sat on the floor, and put her head on her knees. The thread did not always kill. It sometimes measured. Merrick brought in a boy from a corner shop who had a line drawn across his lip like a threadmaker's smile. The boy said a line had brushed him like a cat's tail, and that his first thought had been of his grandfather's jokes about girls who talk too much. He was ashamed of the thought but not of the scar. He asked for a picture and took one in the bathroom mirror with his phone. He titled it "Kissed by the Seamstress" and sent it to a girl who understood that symbols are a currency and immediately blocked him. In the lab, Petra stood at a monitor with a sound engineer who owed her a favor from a case with entirely different nouns. They boosted the basement recording until it showed its teeth. Under the noise, a melody emerged, reluctant, like a child coming indoors. It was a lullaby that had learned to be a map. The engineer, who had a musician's practical cruelty, stripped away the lowest register, and what remained was a series of pressures that matched, in rough ratio, the loops and crosses printed on the mouths of the dolls above. Petra felt stupid for weeping. The engineer, who was kinder than he wanted to be, turned a dial and pretended to be surprised by the result so she could pretend to be surprised too. "You hear it?" he asked. "I hear counting," she said. "I hear instruction." "You hear a choir," he said, and she did. The pressure came then in a shape Rodek disliked because it looked like help. A ministry liaison arrived with his tie knotted to the millimeter and a smile that stopped a courtesy short of friendship. He set a folder on the captain's desk as if returning borrowed property. "We'd like to harmonize messaging," he said. "It is important to tamp down panic. We propose you attribute the incidents to an individual acting with wire and coercion, some kind of gang hazing, perhaps. If you say this with confidence, the press will find it easy to repeat. And if we say a song is being written with mouths? The captain asked, in his good way of making questions sound like statements. The liaison did not blink. Then you will raise the possibility that songs can be written with mouths, he said, and people will ask you to sing them. He looked at Radek with a kind of professional politeness that makes men into departments. You are the lead investigator, yes? You know what I mean. Say less. Radek considered, briefly, what it would be like to be the kind of man who could say less in sleep. He thought of the stairwell, of the paper tray lid that had been found beside the watchman, of the way the wire had nested as if gathering itself for a winter. He said, "We will say what is true. You will say what is useful," the liaison corrected gently. "You will say it before midnight." They said less. The press said more to fill the vacuum. Tailors were insulted on trams. A girl threw a handful of needles at a police van and laughed when they scattered because laughter is an old defense. In a craft store on Vodakova, a clerk found that their wall of notions made passers-by flinch. She covered the hooks with a bedsheet. The bedsheet looked like a shroud and shoppers crossed themselves without admitting it. A jeweler took his wire off display and said he had never liked the feel of it anyway. The radio ran a piece on urban legends and how to recognize them. People listened and then called in theories that were more inventive and less comforting than the host had been prepared to hear. That night, just before midnight, a man who had appeared on television to say that he did not believe in superstition went to smoke in his courtyard rather than on his balcony because he had superstitions about balconies. He leaned against the wall and thought about his argument with the host about people's appetite for theater. A wire moved across the mouth of the alley the way a spider finds its own line in the wind. He did not see it, but he felt it, the intention of it on his breath. He turned his head to clear the sensation, and the line moved with him as if pulled by agreement. When they found him at dawn, his lips were stitched so neatly that the nurse who cut them asked, under her breath where the lips could not overhear, whether the person who had done it had loved him after all. Radek began to think in terms of removal, of cutting all the lines at once, of bringing up the central bench and setting it on a truck and letting the city see the thing that had written its fear under their noses. He did not say this aloud because Lenka would have told him there was no safety in spectacle. Instead, he drew and redrew the basement from memory, inventing exits where the plan said none and none where the room had smiled. He paced his apartment and wore an ellipse into the carpet. He stood still and the ellipse wore itself deeper. They took statements. They took names. They made lists of people who might be next because sometimes you have to teach coincidence to come to heal. The list included those who had trespassed, those who had filmed, those who had edited, those who had tightened the screws on the hatch and those who had loosened them, those who had written about the workshop for money, those who had written about it for pleasure, those who had led prayers against it. Radek added, in a darker column he did not show, the clerk with the cough, the jeweler who had complained a century ago, the engineer who had dragged his feet, the girl whose pen had made a small sun on the edge of her board and then drawn a line away. 2 names were crossed out before he could get them under protection. The urban explorers who had gone viral were found in different neighborhoods, mouths sutured with different degrees of care. The boy survived. The girl did not and left behind a phone that had recorded the ceiling of her apartment, the corner where 2 walls meet and collect the day. On the footage, if you knew your own breath well enough to subtract it, you could hear a counting. Someone online slowed the file and added a ghost overlay of strings because you cannot stop people from scoring their fears. Petra, who knew better, walked to the river and threw up behind a kiosk. When she returned to the office, she developed the last of the basement frames because that was what living looked like that afternoon. On one, there was a flare on the beam end that did not appear on the frames either side. She printed it and put it beneath the photograph of Klara Havelkova. She did not tell herself what it looked like because she did not want to be that kind of late. Marek stopped speaking for an afternoon and then spoke too much for an hour and then apologized to everyone in the room individually. He had begun to put his fingertips to his lip when he thought and stopped because the motion felt like permission. He visited the boy with the threadmaker's smile and told him, with exaggerated gravity, that scars were not symbols. The boy, who was kind in the thoughtless way of people who have been loved, said, "Okay," and believed him until he got home. The calls to Radek's phone became a chorus with 3 voices. reporters, citizens who wanted stories to end cleanly and saw him as a broom, and the captain, whose calls were the ones Rodek answered because duty is just an old word for staying. The captain said, "They want this quiet." Rodek said, "It is already quiet." The captain said, "They want it the kind of quiet that goes on air." Rodek said nothing because words felt like wire if you paid them out without purpose. That evening he went back to the workshop to think in the hum that had made the building's attention so legible. He unlocked the outer door and stood in the threshold and did not step inside. He listened as if to a neighbor's radio through plaster. The small compressions of the rooms around the central room, the settling of dust, the sound of his own uncertainties admitting themselves. He considered burning again and saw the wire blossom in heat and do as it pleased. He considered sealing and heard the city laughing in a week when the story turned from panic to myth. He considered going below and did not allow himself to consider not coming back. On television, a panel of experts discussed the psychology of imitation. A woman with arched eyebrows said the human mouth is a symbol and symbols are cheap. A man with a haircut that involved more planning than thought said the police were obligated to apprehend someone to calm the city. The anchor asked whether the lullaby was authentic and played a 21-second clip that hummed through living rooms like a diagnosis. Somebody muted the sound and could still hear it because that is how the mind works. At midnight, the phones at dispatch lit with calls. A conservatory student on Smetanovo Nabrizi reported a silver line strung between two trees at the height of his throat. A couple in Zizkov watched something glint across their window, the way a needle finds its own path through cloth. Nothing took them, not then. The calls were like pins set in a map. The city had always been a pincushion. Now it learned to think of itself as a pattern. Rodek wrote an order to pull non-essential officers off night street duty not because he thought it would save lives, but because he refused to feed the room bodies. He sent a message to the liaison saying they would not be providing an individual to prosecute in the morning. He called Svoboda to ask what would happen if one were to introduce a cut to the central thread while keeping the others under tension. She said he would likely be rewired in unexpected ways, and he thanked her because honesty is a better comfort than hope. He waited for sleep to propose itself, and sleep did not. He stood in his kitchen and watched steam rise from water he had boiled solely to watch steam. He let the kettle cool and poured it out, and the steam rose anyway. He thought of the picture of Clara with the thimble shining a little too brightly, and of the missing basement on the amended plan, and of the seam the boards had learned to hide. He thought of the childlike neatness of the coil in the glass dish at the morgue. He thought of the two words he had written, Clara, choir dot, and did not cross either out. Near dawn he wrote a note to himself on a square of paper he would later misplace and then find behind a radiator. If you don't go alone, she will learn the rhythm of a group and conduct you. If you go alone, you will only have the rhythm of your own breath to betray you. He left the note on the table and went to rinse his face. He looked at himself the way you look at a stranger in a hotel mirror when you have woken in the wrong bed and the wrong city and have to choose a name to answer to. He chose his own. In the morning, the captain said, "You look like a man halfway to a decision." "In the morning," Rodek said. "Everyone looks like that. Say less," the liaison told him at noon. "Say nothing," the captain told him at 4. "Do something," Petra told him at 6. He thought of the wire paying out under the thimble and of the flywheel's obedient tick. He thought of the Count Adela had shown him with loops and crosses that weren't letters. He thought of the woman who had called herself careful on her own licenses and of a city that had decided carefulness would save it the trouble of difficult mercy. He packed a small bag just before 11. The old key with its stubborn wards, a pair of shears heavy enough to hold their choice, a cheap rosary he did not intend to pray, chalk, the air monitor, a flashlight with a lens that had never yet forgiven a lie. He did not leave a note because leaving notes is a superstition disguised as courtesy. He stood in the street and felt the hour lower itself over the city with the slow dignity of a theater curtain. Somewhere, bells argued about which was correct. He walked toward the workshop as if the shortest line between 2 points had a right to expect people to behave. By the time the clock hesitated at midnight, Rodek had decided. He would go back to the workshop alone and ask the basement the question it had been waiting a century to be asked. He went alone because groups have rhythms and rhythms can be conducted. The street recognized him the way streets learn people who refuse to stop coming. It made room. The workshop door gave at the touch of the old key with a compliance that suggested rehearsal. He had brought the shears, the chalk, the air monitor, a small torch whose lens had never forgiven a lie. He had not brought luck. Luck belongs to people who believe the world negotiates. Inside, the light was wrong. He had cut his lamps as soon as the door fell to behind him, expecting the room to accept its darkness back with possessive relief. Instead, a pallid clarity lay over the benches, the kind of light that accumulates without source, as if the air has been told to remember brightness. The spools glinted modestly. The stove wore its old iron like the patience of the poor. Every object had an edge. It was not bright. It was decided. He stood just inside the threshold and listened. Rooms reveal themselves by how they hold sound, and this one held it like breath. A hum gathered and released, too steady to be electricity, too disciplined to be plumbing. Machines were working somewhere without moving. He marked the door frame with chalk out of habit and out of respect. He had a superstition of leaving a small language for himself to step back into if the room decided to speak over him. The hatch was not latched. It lay like a taut mouth in a quiet face. He lifted it, and the sound it made was already counted by whatever listened below. The first steps received him with the old carefulness of wood. Air rose to meet him. Iron, starch, that faint lavender saved by drawers and habit. He set the air monitor's nose forward. The little bird's heart beat green. He went down. The basement had prepared itself. The wires were still strung, a geometry of obedience. The anchors sat in their numbered patience as if a meticulous god had finally been satisfied. But the room no longer felt like a plan. It felt like an instrument held in a musician's lap. The silver lines wore a tremor not visible as much as legible to skin. The flywheel on the machine had rotated a minute's worth since the last visit. A change so small the hand refuses to admit it till the eye insists. Roddick stood where they had stood and did not enter yet. The chalk made a small cross on the post beside him. The shears warmed in his palm the way things do when hands prepare excuses for them. He took the path Lenka had mapped in tags that no longer hung there. Something had tidied. The lowest wires at throat height now ran an inch higher, deferent, as if a host had remembered the stature of a guest. He passed between two strands at the level of his eyes and felt the small press of their attention on his corneas. When he looked away, it followed like an afterimage. The figure at the machine, the mannequin they had named to keep their nouns steady, sat as before, correct at the bench. Back straight, wrists taut to patience, the thimble heavy on the place where a head would declare an identity. Its hands were poised an instant short of work. It was unchanged in every way that matters when change happens. And yet Roddick knew it had been waiting. Objects learn the hours of the people who love them. The hum thickened. A thread of sound ran under the silver, then around it, then through it. He recognized the architecture of the lullaby the way one recognizes a childhood apartment by the corridor's echo. Loop, cinch, cross, the counted pieties of a person who believes numbers are a mercy. He remembered Adela's hand making the seamstress's gesture. The dip and pull, the press of the thumb, the little turn that tames tension. His mouth went dry at the word tames, as if it had been the wrong verb all century. "Clara," he said, trying the name in a room that had learned to dislike names. The word sounded like it had been pushed through cloth. He had not intended to speak. The room received the offering without gratitude. Something rose into the air where the rafters should have argued darkness. It was not smoke. It was the glint a needle makes when you tilt it through light, multiplied until the multiplication became a texture. At first he thought he had disturbed dust, and then the dust learned to align. Needles, he thought, not because he saw points, but because he felt points the way lips feel a draft by absence made exact. The swarm moved with the intelligence flocks borrow from math. It gathered, loosened, narrowed, and drew itself to a line as straight and unforgiving as a seam. He did not back away. He lowered his chin to deny the throat. Fear takes instruction if you give it. He lifted the shears and did not open them. They would be nothing more than the shape of a refusal if he used them at the wrong time. The swarm swerved politely around the arc of the raised blades as if the gesture counted as grammar. He found himself nearly laughing with the terror that mimics relief. The hum adjusted. The wires achieved a quiet unison and then separated again, as if answering staves. A small motion began at the machine, the pedal depressed by the weight of a foot that was not a foot. The flywheel answered with the docility of a remembered task. The needle dipped and rose. The thread from beneath the thimble paid out half a breath. He watched it without blinking and felt his eye ache as if the thread had been drawn across it. The mannequin's hand moved. It was not a twitch. It was a taut motion that belonged to work. Forefinger lifted and guided the loop. Thumb pressed a place to hold it. The wrist turned with a confidence that comes from injury and then from mastery. The wire at the wrist did not protest this time. It contributed. The hand reached toward nothing and found exactly what it intended to find. No cloth. Air takes stitches if the stitcher believes the world is misbuttoned. "Speak," said a voice, and the word did not come from the thimble or from the air. It came from around things, the bench wood, the iron post, the wire itself taking the shape of language the way water takes the shape of a cup. "Speak, and I'll stitch you quiet." He had thought he was prepared for the intuition of voice. He had not been prepared for its etiquette. The timbre was not cruel. It was pleased. Adela's last small writing returned. She was pleased. He found himself absurdly angry that satisfaction could live this long. He kept his mouth closed. He was not demonstrative with his hands. He let his breathing settle into an algebra of requirements. In counts of 3, out counts of 5, a child's game of self-hurting. The swarm lowered to the level of his face and trembled there, humming, not yet touching, measuring. He recognized the movement the way a tailor recognizes a customer's mouth for a fitting. He had watched his mother unspool measuring tape and slide it against a seam not to cut but to imagine the cut. This was that gesture, touched to his skin by a century that mistook intimacy for competence. "Clara," he said again softly, because names, even their wrong ones, were tools and he had brought only a few. "You made quiet," he said, "the way other people make dresses. You fitted it to people who were not your size. It does not suit them." The thimble turned a fraction, as if a face had acknowledged a compliment. The motion revealed nothing and conveyed attention. The pedal sighed. A wire somewhere above his head eased and another tightened in answer. The swarm tilted so that his lips sat in the shallow of a bowl of intention. "You took mouths," he said, "because mouths make mistakes. You corrected them. You thought the city would thank you." The voice, that arrangement of room and wire, answered with the patience of someone explaining a thing to a child. "I kept them from wasting themselves. The consonants came through iron, the vowels through wood. I kept them from making cheap weather. I taught them to count." He wanted, irrationally, to apologize for the century that had answered nobody with gratitude. He wanted to ask who had taught her to count. He stood still. The chalk mark at the post behind him glowed like propriety. The needles gathered closer, the swarm narrowing to a disciplined line. He could feel the field of it, pressure without contact. He thought of the smooth bruise on the pallet Svoboda had shown him and raised the shears the smallest amount, not as threat as punctuation. "If you speak," the voice said again, indulgent, "I will stitch you quiet. You are the kind that wastes breath on blank paper." He tried not to laugh. He made a small, inoffensive noise in his nose that still counted as speech, and the swarm leaned in. The first touch was not a puncture. It was the suggestion of a radius against his lip, as if someone were drawing a circle and asking whether he preferred a tighter fit. He did not move. The wire tasted the curve of his mouth with the impersonal competence of a measurement. "Loop," said the room, almost fond. "Cinch. Cross." He felt the tiniest nick. It arrived like an idea and left like a fact. Heat followed. He tasted metal, new and old. He thought of Merrick with his fragile, ridiculous courage and his steri-strip like a small bridge. He thought of the bridges on other mouths and felt rage improve his posture. "You taught hands to keep working while you slept?" he said. keeping his lips still enough that speaking hurt and the hurt sharpened the words. "What did you teach your quiet to do when you woke?" The swarm faltered, not in confusion, not with that mind, but as if considering politeness. The thimble turned the width of one die dimple. Above him the wires droned a chord. The flywheel made a tick so precise, he could have set a watch by it if he had wanted to share time with this room. A second touch came at the opposite edge of his mouth. Not a puncture. Promise. He held. He did not cut lines. Not yet. He stepped back the smallest distance, and the swarm came with him like a dog trained to heel. He put the post between himself and the machine, and the swarm paused to consider etiquette again. It did not like furniture used as a person. He took the chance the pause afforded and drew the shears across the lowest wire at knee height, not to free himself, not to escape, but to learn the room's temper. The blades closed with the familiar marital clack of metal consenting to metal. The strand did not give. The shears rang faintly, as if he had struck a tuning fork. He had expected that. He did not expect what followed. The other wires tightened in sympathy, as if consoling a friend, as if the room had backed itself into a choir posture. "You can't cut the choir," the voice said, calm as law. "You must cut the soloist." He felt the smallest ridiculous triumph to have drawn instruction. He glanced at the thread that paid from beneath the thimble and saw how it entered the eye of the machine's needle and from there climbed the air like an articulated thought. He knew what the soloist was. He also knew that if he cut it now, he would be punished with education. The room would teach him what bodies are worth when tied to intention. "You used mouths as spools," he said, saying it made him colder than he had been at the door. "You paid silence into them and took it back out like thread." "I improved them," said the wire with kindly fatigue. "I made them useful." He took another step and the swarm followed. He took another and felt a wire whisper against his cheekbone, a courtesy that came with the warning of hair lifted in weather. He could go around the bench or stand at it like a pupil called forward. He chose the grammar of refusal. He walked along the cage wall instead, keeping the wire's attention at the side of his face, refusing the theatrics of the center. The hum tightened. A handful of needles, not the whole swarm, just a convincing sample, peeled off and arranged themselves parallel at his eye level. For a brief childish second he believed he could see their tiny eyes glinting. Then he had to accept that his mind had supplied eyes to make his fear legible. He did not blink. He dared his eyes to water. He let them. He stopped 3 paces from the bench. The machine's belt had frayed further. A short run of wire links had been added, as if someone who respected leather had been forced to hire metal as a foreman. The pedal depressed a fraction with nobody's weight. The needle dipped and rose and did not thread him. The voice had gone quiet because the room was listening to him the way it listened to its own instructions. Loop, cinch, cross, waiting to see whether he would fit. He raised the shears to shoulder height. He did not open them. He thought briefly of blessing. His captain joking he should have the blades touched to an altar. Petra saying she could find a priest whose theology admired sharp things. Lenka saying steel is steel and blessings are only shapes. And then thought of the hard, plain kindness of people who believe without needing to be believed. He stepped once more as if to cut, and the swarm came with him too quickly, too fond of obedience, and grazed him. It was not a deep cut. It was exactly straight. A brief, polite nip across his upper lip, placed with a tailor's promise. You see how easily this could fit. He tasted coin. He kept his teeth together because the first stitch is always the most persuasive. He felt the anger again, cleansing and unsustainable. "Enough," he said. He did not know whether he said it to the room, to the century, to his own intention. The chalk mark on the post behind him felt like a hand on his back. He took 2 slow steps backward, then 3, refusing to turn, to give a nape to the thing that collected throats. The swarm pressed against his retreat like a cat against a leg and then, whether from boredom or policy, let him go. The machine made one last polite dip and rise, as if to sign the work. The thread beneath the thimble drew in a hair's breadth, reabsorbing its generosity. He stood at the stairs and did not look away. The wires stilled not to rest but to resume potential. The mannequin returned to the posture of correctness that false innocence prefers. On the third step up, the hum changed. It did not fade. It withdrew the way music withdraws when you leave a house where someone insists on practicing. At the hatch, he paused long enough to chalk a second mark over his first. Not because it would deter anything, but because it declared that someone had been permitted both entry and exit. He lifted the hatch gently shut and let it accept its own weight. Upstairs, the brightness retreated in a single slow gesture, as if a hand had closed over a candle without pain. Shadows resumed their familiar corners. The stove remembered the ordinary. He leaned against the wall beside the door and let the taste of metal turn to taste of salt. He wiped the blood from his lip and saw the rightness of the line. A seamstress's first test, the mark of a mouth measured and found acceptable. He hated that the cut was beautiful. He laughed, once, into the room's polite face. Out on the street, the night had resumed its tolerable lies. He locked the door with the new key and the old and pressed his palm against the wood because he still believed in gestures no room could own. His breath came back as property. On the way home, he found himself nodding to strangers as if he could return their mouths to them by small courtesies. He did not call anyone. He did not tell himself a story in which his not running counted as courage. He let the anger cool into a plan. He wrote 3 words on the back of a receipt and stuck it in his wallet where only money tends to live. Mouths as vessels. He added a 4th across the top because a plan lacking superstition is easier to defeat. Choir. He stood at his sink, turned the tap, and watched water draw a line into the metal of the basin that would have pleased a person like Clara. He imagined cutting the central thread. He imagined breaking the choir. He imagined bringing in a different tool at a different angle, something that would refuse instruction and offer mercy instead. He imagined failure with such fidelity that it became a rehearsal for survival. He slept for an hour and a half and dreamed of a thimble rolling in a circle on a table, never reaching an edge because someone had taught the world to be round. He had seen the seamstress sit and work. He had felt her measure his mouth. He left the basement with a single conviction sharp enough to cut. She did not merely silence, she filled. Mouths were spools. Voices were thread. The city was being wound toward a choir she meant to finish. By morning, the cut on Rodek's lip had turned to a thin, correct seam, the kind that makes hospital tape look ceremonial. He went first to the office and then, ignoring the calendar of people who imagined they owned his hours, to the Faculty of Arts, where rooms still smelled of chalk even when nobody used it. He had asked for a linguist by habit and for an ethnomusicologist by superstition. What arrived in the same sensible shoes was Dr. Eliska Horokova, whose dissertation had been on the grammar of old songs and whose voice made difficult ideas sound as if someone had ironed them. She listened without interruption to the basement hum Petra had brought, eyes on the desk, hands folded the way a person keeps their hands when they know the habit of fidgeting is a kind of confession. When the clip ended, she let the silence rest long enough to acquire meaning, then said, "Not a melody, accounting, but it behaves like melody when it is mapped to breath." Rodek set out the photographs as if he were laying knives down where a priest could see them. Victims' mouths, dolls' mouths, the loops and crosses repeating with the confidence of a law. Adela's board with its blunt letters, loop/cinch/cross. The still frames from the basement where the flywheel seemed to have remembered one tick too many. Dr. Horokova took a pencil and a sheet of thin staff paper from her bag. She did not write notes first. She drew mouths. In a neat hand, she copied the stitches from the nearest photograph. Loop, cinch, cross, and beneath each she drew a mark. Union for loop, for cinch, X for cross. The marks fell into a rhythm that refused to be decorative. Prosody, she said. The mouth knows where stress belongs. Sewing there, here. A tap of her pencil on the cross creates pressure. If she is using mouths as resonators, the crosses are your stressed syllables. Like scansion, Petra asked, careful with her own astonishment. Like a loom, Horokova said. Prosody plotted as warp, breath as weft. Your cinch keeps time. Your loop holds duration. The cross anchors stress. See, she translated the marks into a line of little pipes and arches. Long, short, short, long. Then, almost impatient with herself for the concession to music, She added stems and turned them into notes. Nothing anyone could sing, and yet a line any choir director's hand would recognize. Merrick, who had been standing as if he did not trust chairs, leaned in. "Chords," he said, pointing at a photograph of the stitches stacked on the girl in the pushchair. "I said chords, and I didn't want to be right." "You were half right," Horokova said. "This wants to be a canon, not a chord." Voices entering at measured intervals, each carrying the same tune, each bound to a different part of the loop. "If you overlay these," she tapped 3 victims' mouths in different hands, "you will get imitation, not harmony. It is stricter, crueler." Rodek felt the word imitation catch. It had been used against them on television. Here it made a different kind of sense, the kind that fits like a well-cut coat. "How many voices?" he asked. She shrugged the way the honest do when asked for theology. "As many as she was denied. As many as she believes a city ought to have when it sings correctly." She turned to Petra. "May I hear the recording again?" Petra started the file and then, unasked, pulled up the damped version the engineer had built, the one that peeled away the lowest register until the wire's pressure could be heard as a shape. Under it, the ghost of a tune peered out like a child from behind a skirt. Hajj, Ninj, not sung, but enacted as tension. Horokova did not close her eyes. Her pencil moved in half-syllables. "Variance," she said, and now the iron in her voice warmed. "Listen to the second phrase. The turn there, the tiny curl, Moravian. But the cadence here," she drew a sharper fall, "Prague's old German quarter. And this, a narrow scoop, South Bohemia, village speech taught to behave in the city." She glanced up and saw their faces harden around the implications. "Songs travel," she said gently. "They pick up dirt from every town they pass." "Not dirt," Petra said, surprising herself. "Proof." She nodded. "Proof that what is being collected here is not just voices. It is variance, old habits of singing. She is making a choir out of versions. She wants completeness." Rodek thought of the personnel ledger with its tidy America that never sailed, of families who had been told their girls had gone, and of a woman who had written "I heard them in the floor" in a confession book because she had had no other language. He thought of a basement restrung overnight to accommodate a man's height because a host who cares about correctness cares about fittings. "If we remove the wires," Lenka said, practical as always, "the pattern collapses. If we slack them, they lose pitch. If we melt them, silver wire balls and breaks. It will not carry tension. Fire is an unsentimental editor." "Fire is a choir director," Merrick said, deadpan. "Which is why choir directors are beloved." "No," Petra said, very soft, but unwilling to give the word back once she had said it. "Fire is a conductor who insists there is only one tempo for mourning. They let that stand." Horokova angled a doll's mouth photograph under the light and frowned. "The stitches here. See the way the spiral tightens, then relaxes, then tightens again? That is a round. She is planning recursion." Her pencil ticked out measures. "And the number of loops between crosses? 4, 6, 8, 5. If this were ornamental, I would call it clumsy. It is not. It is deliberate. These are syllable counts from lullabies, old ones. Not the printed collections. The ones grandmothers sing when they are too tired to remember more than the bones of a song. Missing children of the 1920s, Rodek said, because saying it folded the thought into his case rather than letting it keep prowling the edges. Field recordings? Some, Horokova said. Wax cylinders, archived badly, mislabeled as folk amusements. But better than that, older women who insisted that their grandmothers had sung melodies different from the new ones, and that the old ones had been the right ones. If you brought me hair from people kept in that workshop, I would tell you whether they had heard more German than Czech before they came. But we are not there yet, and I am not that kind of witch. It was not a joke. It was a reminder that inference has rules. Rodek slid a photograph across to her. The sample card of needles with its bottom trench where something small had once been tied and then removed. What was here? Lace making, she said without hesitation. The pricking of a bobbin lace pattern leaves that groove. Bohemian lace, your Prababika wore it on her cuffs. It reads like music if you know how to look. Pins are notes. Threads are voices. You travel the pattern along a path of crossings and cinches. She smiled, not out of pleasure. Loop, cinch, cross. What you have is a lace-maker who became a seamstress, or a seamstress who envied lace. Petra, whose patience with metaphor had been eaten thin by practical fear, said, "And those cages? The bone fragments." "Lace pins used to be bone," Horokova said, the kind of answer that makes a room drop 2 degrees. "Not human, usually. But that is a different question than whether someone wanted them to be." She turned the page over and wrote, almost idly, "Collecting versions/canon/choir. If she is building toward a fixed number, it may be the number of voices she believes unrepresented, the number of children she lost, or the number the city took, or a number a church taught her by accident." "There was a choir," Petra said, hearing the word say itself at last. "Girls below stairs. The Union Minutes." "We don't know that," Rodek said, "because they didn't and because refusing premature certainty kept him alive. We know enough to be certain of the shape," Horokova said, and underlined choir in a way that made it look less like a word and more like a cut that had learned to spell. "And I know enough to tell you that if you let this settle, it will tune the city to itself in a way you will not like. People will hear the count when they stir soup. They will hear loop, cinch, cross in the walk sign beeps. They will begin to keep time with it when they hush their children." She set the pencil down. "You cannot let an instruction this elegant get popular." "What breaks it?" Lenka asked. "Not on paper. In a room. Removing tension kills song," Horokova said. "Enough slack and even devotion cannot hold pitch. Unstring it all at once. Or ruin the soloist." She nodded to the photograph where the short wire links had replaced the leather belt on the machine. "Break the belt and she will find another way, but not then. Cut the thread under the thimble and you will get a reaction. Not the kind you want. We melt the web," Lenka said. "We fog the room. We ruin the temper. We bring real heat." "Fire," Merrick said, not quite able to keep from sounding 16, which was better than sounding afraid. Rodek imagined the wire blooming into beads, the silver raining into a small constellation on the floor. He imagined heat lifting the smell of starch until it turned to sweet rot. He imagined the mannequin's hands blackening into the shapes they had been pleased to hold. He imagined the city's sirens pressed quiet by a lullaby. He did not say these images aloud. He said, "We control it. We bring the brigade in on the plan. We clear the block. We light once and we don't have to light again. We take away the instrument." "You will fail," Horokova said, so gently it sounded like sympathy and not warning. "But it is not my place to forbid you." "Why do you think we'll fail?" Petra asked. "Because you've already been taught the count," she said. "Because she will ask your fire to keep time and fire loves rhythm. Because you will make a choir out of hoses and shouts and boots. Because some things end only when they are finished and not when they are stopped." She saw their faces set. "But even failure teaches, and you need another lesson before the last one." Rodek tucked the staff paper into his notebook as if paper could change the quality of what it held. "We'll take that lesson now," he said. "We do not leave the web to teach itself." He called the captain. To his surprise, the captain did not argue. The morning's telephones had apparently exhausted his appetite for skepticism. "The minister wants to hear the word arsonists from someone's mouth before evening," he said. "I prefer to give him controlled burn from mine. Bring in the brigade. Consult the engineer. Draw perimeters. If we're to play at theater, we sell all the seats." They planned the day the way good people plan weddings and bad people plan wars. The engineer, chastened, came with structural drawings and the face of a man who has realized the consequences of underestimating wood. The fire brigade brought a pair of old hands with the kind of superstition that saves lives because it has learned never to call itself superstition aloud. They would plant charges to open the basement to the street. No chimney to feed, no sealed room to hoard flame. They would flood the space with foam built to smother stubborn materials. They would drive air out instead of through. They would work fast and leave faster. They would keep a line on the wires until the heat broke them. "Wire this fine?" the older firefighter said. peering at the photographs, not asking how the photographs had been made. It'll curl and give. The silver will clump. Soot it, then kill it. Pray no one breathes the wrong dust. Pray, Merrick said, because sometimes boys ask on purpose to be told off. The man looked at him with a patience that did not deny the word. You'll learn the kinds of prayers that work, he said. They all sound like instructions you give your own hands when they want to shake. Petra printed signs for the cordons and pretended bureaucracy could be a talisman. Lenka walked the perimeter with chalk and plotted exits with her eyes until the building inside the plan looked like a thing you could convince to behave. Rodek packed the shears and did not think how cheap a tool looks when a room has already seen it. At noon, as if on cue from some dreadful director they refused to name, the crime blog posted a new piece. Silver Choir under Ikov, the author, who liked his eyebrows as sharp as his sentences, had found someone to say that the recording sounded like a music box sewn into a wall. Comments taught people new shapes of fright. Someone posted a slowed clip of a child crying over the lullaby and won money and hatred. The ministry liaison sent a text that said harmonized messaging and added a smile that did not make it to his face. Rodek sent one word back: burning. He did not add your consent is not a condition because he did not need to. Some decisions make their own paperwork. Before the sun slid, he took the staff paper back to the hospital. Adela read the notation as if it were a letter from someone she had known in a different country. She nodded once, then wrote, "She collects the parts people don't sing anymore." She added, "Smaller. The quiet parts." He took the paper back and folded it with a care he did not grant legal forms. Evening brought an indecently clear sky, the kind that makes city lights into a critique. The trucks came without sirens. Men stepping down with the economy of people who believe less movement is fewer mistakes. The engineer laid his hand on the building like a farmer on the neck of a horse he meant to sell. The crew set charges on the street-facing wall above the seam. Foam feeds were readied. Hoses lay loose along the curb like sleeping ropes. "Once we open, we don't stop," the chief said. "If it sings at you, don't answer." "It will," Rodek said. "We won't." The cordons pushed the curious back into the shadows where people feel safer hating their curiosity. Windows across the block side as their owners chose whether to pretend they had not seen the notices. The city arranged itself into an audience because that is what cities do when someone arranges a stage. Rodek stood beside Lenka and Petra and Merrick and felt the peculiar, guilty confidence that comes when a plan has too much momentum to doubt. He was not certain of outcome. He was certain of entry. "On your mark," the chief said, and the crew took breath as if for a phrase they knew by heart. "Mark," Rodek said. The charges blew. The workshop opened its sealed mouth to the street. Foam rushed in like white weather. Beneath it, the silver web shone and held. The seamstress's hum rose to meet the sirens, and for an instant the city sounded as if it had been waiting to sing. The wall gave with a practiced cough. Plaster turning to powder, brick folding into itself as if the building had only been waiting to be relieved of a secret. The hole gaped clean to the basement, a rectangular mouth rimmed with a century's dust. Foam surged in, white and heavy, shouldering its way down the steps, swallowing the air the way winter swallows breath. For a heartbeat, the web took the insult like a patient. Wires beaded with white, the geometry rendered in negative, every line suddenly visible because something had dared to oppose it. Then the foam learned to divide. It slid off the silver as water slides off hair. Where it clung, it thinned to lace. Where it pooled, it sulked at the floor, strangely shy of the anchors. The fire crew worked the nozzles with the competent brutality of people who are paid to end arguments. They sensed resistance and did what training requires. They added more. Heat followed, not first but second, deliberate as a verdict. The crew set the jets, lit the charges that would make warmth hurry, and the basement took a breath none of them could hear and arranged itself to listen. The flywheel on the sewing machine rotated the smallest polite distance and stopped, as if making room for a guest at table. The hum rose. The web tightened in sympathy, a cat's back under a careful hand. Notes the city had forgotten it knew: loop, cinch, cross, stacked into a pressure that did not care whether anyone above ground had names for it. Sirens leaned on their throats and learned shame. The brigade's radios took the signal and made of it a hush. Somewhere a commander tried to say more and found that more would not climb his mouth. Afterwards he would insist he had given the order. Afterwards everyone would agree he had. It is easy to believe histories that protect the voice. Heat should have punked the wire. Drawn silver yields and beads, anneals to softness, loses its temper like a drunk finding prayer. The outer strands did curl, obedient, small beads of metal gathering like insects after rain. But the inner runs held fast, bright as bone. Where the beads formed, tension redistributed, a choir tightening when a tenor falters. The mannequined figure at the machine did not move so much as permit motion. Pedal a sigh, wheel a click, needle a dip and rise that let the thread beneath the thimble pay out a hair's breadth and then reclaim it like a miser reconsidering alms. Then the needles came. They did not explode so much as migrate with conviction. A dozen tins that had slept a century opened the way old eyes opened to a remembered joke. A cloud lifted out of the room's edges and found the hole in the wall. It was not a swarm. Swarms are messy and democratic. This was a procession, orderly, quick, intent. Silver slivers slid forward in a ribbon that bent with the wind and corrected for it. On the street, two officers at the inner cordon lifted their heads in the animal way men do when weather decides them. The ribbon reached them the way a tailor reaches a mouth for a fitting. The first man had time to say "oh" and find that "oh" was useful. The second did not. The spiral laid itself with an elegance that should have shamed it. The wire entered as if returning. Medics cut with sterile scissors, and the coil gave and then retreated down the throat in a movement so intimate the body mistook it for its own. Later, Svoboda would say obstruction in a report that believed in paper. "Out!" barked the chief through a radio that would not carry consonants, only shape. Foam still pushed forward. Heat still worked. The web sang as if the day had been arranged for it. The lullaby rose and found the pitch of emergency. Sirens flickered into something like harmony and then, with a small offended gesture, stopped. For half a minute the block learned what silence feels like when it is imposed. Not absence, not peace, but a weight. Every mouth felt its own architecture. Lips too aware of being lips, teeth rehearsing the names they'd been given. Petra had her camera a hand's width from her face and could not persuade her fingers to press the shutter. Lenka stood with her clipboard and realized she had set the pencil between her teeth, as if needing a stand-in to keep her mouth occupied. Merrick gripped the tape reel and found himself counting 3 in, 5 out, fighting the childish relief of being told how to breathe. Rodek listened to the lullaby folding the street like laundry and felt anger return. The clean, unwelcome kind that throws doors in a neat house. Inside, Flame found something that wasn't fuel and delighted in it. It licked the web and learned to keep time. The wires glowed. The beads multiplied. A smell like ironed cotton lifted and settled. A run of links on the machine belt blackened and the leather beside them smoked and parted, and still the needle dipped and rose. Thread paying out and reeling in with the fussy thrift of a seamstress who saves even the knots. "Vent it!" shouted the chief, and the word came out a gesture. Additional charges opened the rear, the old warehouse wall flattening into a stage set without a stage. The draft should have pulled fire into greed. Instead the room exhaled like a great beast and the flames went meek. Not out. Obedient. Foam found purchase for a breath and then sloughed off. Resentful. The silver sang a pressure you could taste more than hear. The song gathered and pushed against the city's throat and told it to swallow. A second ribbon of needles rose through the hole, deferent as a procession leaving church. It went high this time, caught a streetlight in passing, made of glass a tiny bell that didn't ring. The ribbon unstitched into a rein and fell in a tidy arc toward the outer cordon. A sergeant lifted his arm by habit. The needles wrote their choice on the skin nearest the mouth, and the habit took his hand halfway to the wound and then abandoned it. He sat down very straight, as if the bench had been offered. He did not get up again. Rodek moved then because anger without motion curdles. He took 2 steps toward the breach before logic reclaimed him by the back of his coat. He would have been measured and then refined. He knew it like you know a stove is hot by remembering your mother's voice. He let the knowledge keep him. He watched instead. Heat wavered, failed, returned in surges like a faith that periodically remembers to believe. The web held the way bridges hold when rivers argue. The mannequin's hands kept their posture as if correct posture could be a prayer. The thimble did not turn. The thread beneath it had begun to glow from within, as if it remembered or it had been and missed it. Petra managed to lift the camera. The frame she took would later show a wheaten flare at the edge of the thimble, a saint's cheap halo bought with bad money. "Kill it!" someone shouted. "Kill it!" Being a word men use when ending and stopping have been confused. The brigade redirected, foam going everywhere foam could go. The hole in the wall filled like a mouth stuffed with a gag and then, indecorously, spat. The white slid back, as if pushed from below by a patient hand. Steam rolled up, translucent, and took on, for a graceless instant, the loose geometry of the wires, looped, cinched, crossed, a ghost of pattern that died at the height of a human eye. And then the fire ended. Not quick. Quick is what happens when oxygen starves or fuel is spent. This was a choice. The glow faded from wire to wire as if a line of women had snuffed candles after Vespers, each with a practiced pinch of wetted forefinger and thumb. The smoke went to ground like an animal that has been told it may sleep now. Heat withdrew its permission. The workshop, as far as buildings know how to make faces, looked offended but intact. The crew stood in their sweating coats and recalibrated to a world that had not altered itself to honor their effort. The chief pulled off his helmet and swore the way a kind man swears when children are watching. Without invention. "Shut down," he said, and now the radios tolerated speech because the song no longer needed to own it. "Pull the line back." Paramedics worked over the two fallen men with hands that had learned to clock grief into efficiency. Svoboda arrived too quickly, which is one way doctors apologize. She said, "I'm sorry," aloud once, not to anyone in particular, and then switched to the vocabulary that keeps the city running. Time, chain, contact. The news frothed, phones lifted, lenses found the hole and made it a story shape. The ministry liaison arrived late enough to have plausible deniability and early enough to claim he had been on site. "Arsonists," he said to a microphone he had brought with him in his pocket. "An organized hoax. The police and fire brigade have it under control." Control lay 3 meters away with a sheet over its face. Nobody corrected the grammar. Lenka stood at the breach and watched foam slide off wire and pool into the same sullenness as before. She made herself write what she saw as if seeing had ever guaranteed recording. Beating observed. Inner runs intact. Foam refuses adhesion. Heat discontinuity consistent with external control. She struck that last phrase and replaced it with unexplained suppression. Engineers like their nouns quiet. She did not. Petra took pictures of the intact web through the hole and felt treachery in the click. The frames would help the city understand the shape of its fear. They would also help the city hunger for more. She lowered the camera and put her forehead briefly against the brick. An old parishioner's habit borrowed in a hurry. Merrick made lists because lists suggested that the world would respond if properly requested. Names of injured, names of witnesses, serial numbers of nozzles and nozzles' temperaments. He wrote 2 and then wrote 2 next to it because some part of him believed that numbers printed as numerals have more authority. He licked his lip and winced and told himself good. Pain was a leash. Roddick did what he always did when a plan defended itself against the people who made it. He stood still until his body remembered walking, then walked. He stepped into the ring of wet street where foam and ash had married, crouched, and lifted a small curl of silver that had beaded and fallen and cooled. It sat like a comma on his glove. He turned it over and it did not reflect the city. It reflected only the hand that held it. "Destruction won't work," he said, and did not know he'd spoken aloud until the chief answered no, without rancor. "What will?" the chief asked, because good men are allowed to be unreasonable when the world has shown itself. Roddick looked through the opening into the basement where the mannequin sat at its bench, where the flywheel had cooled to the patience of iron, where the thread beneath the thimble lay with the air's permission across the room. He remembered the moment in the hum when the voice had mistaken him for a man who wasted breath on paper. He remembered, "You can't cut the choir. You must cut the soloist." "Not the web," he said. "The thread. Any shears will laugh at that." Lenka said, not to refuse to warn. Not any. He heard the audacity in his own voice and let it stand. Something that shares its nature and refuses its use. Silver against silver, Petra said, catching the practical romance of it before she could veto herself. But spoken against. He nodded. Vestment scissors, he said. Cathedral work. The sort made to cut cloth that has been taught to behave. Borrowed, blessed, and asked for a different obedience. Merrick swallowed. You'll go alone again. Yes. He did not add what the note in his pocket said about groups and rhythms. He did not need to teach the room that again. One thing listening, one breath to betray. The liaison had found a camera that made him taller. He was ending a sentence with the word stability when Rodek walked past him without apology. Inspector, the man began. Say less, Rodek said, and kept going. He went first not to the cathedral, but to a small church that kept its silver in velvet drawers and its grudges in the same. The sacristan, a woman with a second job and a first theology, listened to the request as if donors had asked stranger things. She brought out 3 pairs of scissors wrapped in linen, the way bones are wrapped. 1 pair was delicate, for edging. 1 was sturdy, for new cloth. The 3rd was ceremonial, engraved with an old bishop's initials and a single, modest cross near the pivot. This, she said, was blessed the year your workshop was sealed. She did not ask how he knew what he was asking. He did not ask how she knew what he had asked. She put her palm on the metal as if pressing a fever down. Take it if you will bring it back. He nodded, because whatever else the next hours would teach him, they would not teach him to lie to a woman holding scissors wrapped like relics. He slid the blades into a canvas roll and felt the weight settle like a decision. Outside, evening had climbed the city and sat on it like a seamstress on a stool. The workshop, 3 streets away, remembered his feet. He could feel the cut on his lip pulling with each step, a metronome he would not allow to conduct him. He went to the bridge and stood long enough to watch the river decide who it belonged to. He went to the hospital and stood in the corridor outside Adela's room long enough to hear sleep render her breath tuneless. He went home and placed the scissors on his table and sat without turning on a light because he did not want to teach the room the habit of glow. He waited until the city's bells fussed themselves toward midnight. He left without leaving a note. Some promises are not paper. The web had learned to keep time with fire. The city had learned it could be quieted. Rodek carried a pair of silver scissors blessed in a church older than the workshop and walked back toward the hole they had cut in the century. Certain now that if anything could be ended, it would begin with the thread beneath the thimble. He went an hour before midnight because he distrusted beginnings. The scissors lay in their linen, heavy as a promise a parish makes to itself. He put the roll in his coat as if the weight could alter his balance and kept his mouth closed around breath. He had trained not to be theatrical. The workshop accepted him with the blank courtesy of a desk clerk. The strange light had returned, sourceless, decisive, a brightness that seemed to have been polished into the air. He marked the door frame with chalk a 3rd time, not because he believed marks would restrain anything, but because leaving a small language behind had begun to feel like tying a string to his own attention. The hatch to the basement tilted under his hand, lighter than it should have been, as if helped from below by someone who had learned to be a good hostess. He set the air monitor forward. The little green heart consented. The smell, once more, iron and starch and lavender that had earned the right to persist. He descended. The silver web awaited him, the lines drawn so fine they bossed the light into acting proper. The mannequin sat at the machine in perfect posture. The thimble waited where a face would declare. The thread beneath it ran to the needle and from there out into the room and up into the rafters as if meaning could be taught to travel. The hum gathered and made itself known. He could taste the count at the back of his tongue. The wires tightened, attentive. The flywheel moved enough to be undeniable and then stopped, as if the courtesy of beginning belonged to him. She was there in the same way an order is there, no body, only compliance arranged the right way. A thread trembled. The line at his lip itched. An old dog's trick at a wound it can't quite leave alone. Clara, he said, names only do what rooms allow, but some rooms are polite when you are polite first. "I've brought a tool." The thimble turned a fraction. The voice answered from bench and iron and wire, its consonants mechanical, its vowels domestic. "I have all the tools I require." He took the scissors from their roll. They were bright in the way old silver is, the shine earned, not plated, the jaws engraved near the pivot with an initial that had outlived 3 bishops and a war. The cross scratched at the hinge was so modest it might have been a flaw. He held them closed. He did not raise them. "Blessings alter temper," he said, speaking to himself as much as to the room. "They teach metal to refuse." The hum approved of the grammar more than the promise. A small motion rippled through the web. 1 strand tightened, 2 slackened to keep pitch, a discipline you could almost admire if you were a worse person. The flywheel took its 1 polite click. He felt the pressure arrive in front of his mouth the way a mirror's chill arrives as a hand. A slender ribbon of needles rose from the far corner and organized itself into an arc, waiting for his breath to finish a shape. He kept still. He did not deny fear. He asked it to keep time with him. "Speak," said the room, pleased, "and I'll stitch you quiet. There's been too much weather. I will make you useful." He had not expected the word useful to cut as cleanly as it did. He thought of the clerk with the cough and of the watchman who could tell the hour by air and of the girl who had drawn a thimble as large as a face. He thought of the way the wire had accepted heat as if it had been a compliment. He thought of the choir arranged by a woman who loved versions more than people. He stepped toward the bench. The wires, deferent, gave him a path that would not have existed for anyone else. The courtesy frightened him more than malice would have. The ribbon of needles lowered to the altitude of his mouth and trembled, expectant. "We both know there has never been a spool," he said calmly, to buy himself an inch of thought. "But you like the story where I'm offered one." The thimble turned the fraction of a fraction that means a person has smiled without troubling the muscles that would prove it. From beneath the rim, like an old joke remembered for its economy, a wooden spool rolled out and settled against the base of the machine. It was a small thing, polished by use, a groove bitten into its waist by thread that had paid attention. A breath later it was gone, no trick, only withdrawal, the way a hand withdraws from a child it knows will not take what is held out. He did not look at the spool a second time. He lifted the scissors to shoulder height and still did not open them. The ribbon leaned, tasting the pressure at his lip without puncturing, like a tape measure learning a curve. He thought of the ethnomusicologist's line on staff paper, loop, cinch, cross, and of her warning that breaking the line would draw a reaction. He thought of the fire-loving rhythm. He would not give the room his rhythm. He counted wrong on purpose. He made nonsense out of numbers. He taught his breath to misbehave. He moved not fast, not slow, only out of step. The needles missed their first chance to coincide with exhale. The ribbon corrected, tidy, eager to teach. "Loop," said the voice, almost affectionate. "Cinch, cross." He put his left hand, his unblessed hand, under the thread that paid from the thimble and lifted it by the width of a thought, just enough to change the angle at the needle's eye. The line thrummed, offended. The machine's pedal depressed a whisper. He made his right hand late. He put the scissor's lower jaw under that same line and held it there, not contacting, allowing desire and refusal to make their small heat. The web sang softly. The room liked the problem. Tightened 3 lines to answer the lift in his left hand. The pressure at his lip became gentle insistence. He could feel where the circle would begin. He refused to be round. He opened the scissors a finger's width. The needles leaned in. They were not cruel. They were correct. He felt the first flesh-deep promise of a stitch and wanted, for a second unworthy of him, to let it hold, because being held is an old appetite. He shut the appetite with the same muscular decision he used on files that liked to tell their stories in the wrong order. He brought the blades up. The first resistance was a note, not a thing. Steel met silver and found kinship and then doctrine. The left blade carried the cross near the pivot. The mark flashed once, like a very small mouth opening to say no. The line from beneath the thimble tried to dodge and found etiquette in its way. The upper blade drank it, and the lower blade put its back to it the way two friends do at the first sign of trouble. He cut. The reaction did not arrive from the wire. It arrived from the room. The web's pressure went wide and then narrowed, as if someone had thrown a sheet over a quire and another had whipped it off. The needles withdrew and returned in the same motion. The machine's pedal depressed with offended dignity. Somewhere above him, in the first floor's dust, dozens of mouths cracked their stitches the way ice gives under sun. Quietly, with a strange kindness for itself, and opened. What came out was not sound. It was release. The voice tried to gather itself and found no instrument. The thimble turned, a full half-quarter this time, as if a head had jerked. The cut had not been deep enough to sever. It had been clean enough to daunt. He had bought himself a breath and used it. The second cut went home. The blessed steel took the silver the way doors take key cut to shape, metal declaring former oaths null. The line parted. It did not fray. It stepped aside from itself and lay down. Everything else rose. The wires let go of their jobs. The geometry they had made came off its hooks the way habits come off a person who has been reminded of a better one. In the same instant, the needle of the machine drove once, twice, then stitched empty air in a fast, offended blur that meant to catch up and could not. The pedal hammered. The flywheel turned and turned and turned and then seized, as iron seizes when told it has already done enough. The thimble tipped. It rolled the way heavy things roll when arrogance decides to be graceless, optically slow, too fast to stop. In its fall, he saw the figure under it try to keep posture and then forget what posture had been for. The hands that were not hands lifted and reached and failed to touch anything worth holding. For a breath, the rim of the metal framed what would have been a face if faces could choose not to be made. Then the room made a choice for her. She dissolved. No melting, no vapor, only disassembly, as if someone had approached a weave and pulled, slowly, at the single thread that keeps it coherent. The figure became its wire. The wire became its needles. The needles became weather. He lifted the scissors to fend what would come. They met a first spray with the neat clang of instruments surprised to find themselves in combat. A second flock struck and slid. A third found the pivot, the engraved cross, the modest mark that had believed itself an ornament, and said, "This is where you hurt." The blades shattered at the eye. It was not an explosion, nothing dramatic enough to earn the word. It was a choice undertaken by metal. The halves fell together like tired wings and cut his hand on their way to the floor. He kept hold of one and lost the other, and then lost the one he had kept because the swarm decided to have it. He dropped to a crouch with his left forearm across his mouth because a forearm is what a man has when nothing else obeys. Needles drove at his sleeve and nested, lacing the fabric to itself with a speed that felt like dexterity and counted as malice. He turned his face away and felt 4, 5, 6 quick intentions die on his cheekbone where they found bone and changed their minds. The cut on his lip reopened and added its small, faithful measure of salt. He stood into the weather because standing is an old trick that makes men taller than their fear. He put his shoulder to the bench because resisting is a job benches understand. The hum that had governed the room took on a high, furious whine that was almost human. He dug his nails under the thimble's rim and threw it. It rang once, a school bell declaring wrong dismissal, and struck a cage and fell perfectly quiet under its own weight. He did not know, afterward, whether the dolls' mouths upstairs opened to sing or only to yawn after a long sleep. He knew the pressure changed. The choir lost pitch. The wire that had been everywhere refused to be anywhere. A sound like rain on tin went on for a long time that later would compress itself into a sentence. Needles falling, needles finding wood, needles writing their lines into the floor. He tried to step back and did not. A dense portion of weather overtook him, not sharp now but heavy, as if Cuttings had decided the cheapest route home was through his coat. He let his knees go to save his mouth. The room blurred at the edges and came back wrong. He remembered thinking, "Don't breathe in." He remembered thinking, "If you breathe in, you will take possession of her instruction." He remembered the idiot, fearless concentration of deciding the exact shape of not breathing and then having to do it with a chest that had opinions. Hands took him. Not the room's hands. The humankind, clumsy and eager and afraid to be afraid. He felt pressure under his arms and a weight at his belt. He felt foam suck on his boots and then release him. He felt air change angle and become vertical. He rose. On the floor above, light went out in a normal way for the first time since the case began. He heard someone say his name the way names get said when people don't want to tell the room they love you. He heard a string of instructions: easy now, hold, watch the lip, and then nothing, because nothing is a kind of mercy men who do this work have earned. When he returned to a room that stayed still and did not hum, the ceiling was a respectable gray, and the air smelled like wet coats and sudden helpless coffee. He blinked. Petra was above him and too close and refusing to look like someone above him and too close. Lenka had the look people get when an equation gives up and becomes a prayer. Marek's lip strip had gone loose and his hands shook because they were young enough to tell the truth. Radek tried to speak and the shape of no was all his mouth would permit. He closed it again because no had learned to be a poor tool lately. Someone offered water, he took it. It tasted of steel and of the kind of tap that gets used to rinse blood. He sat up too soon and accepted the penalty. He looked at the hatch and did not want to look and looked anyway. The web had fallen. Not cut. Not neatly collapsed into piles of useful salvage, but given up on acting like a single thing. The wires lay in lax, insulting drifts, puddled silver like the leavings of a day a good seamstress would call spoiled. The bench had shifted half a meter and then decided to stay. The machine sat with a heel lifted like a stubborn child's shoe. The thimble lay under the cage where he had thrown it. It had a dent so small he could not have put a number to it. He counted anyway. They carried him to the street on a stretcher because once a stretcher has been involved there are rules about it. The night had lost its appetite for unusual light. It had taken back the old sodium glow that makes cities look equally guilty. People at the cordon had the decency to look away and the indecency to look back. The ministry liaison had gone to write a sentence where control appeared near a predicate that made grammarians nervous. Svoboda met the stretcher with mild reprimand in her expression and praise in the hands she pretended were only practical. She cleaned the reopened line and did not talk about its beauty. She touched the cut on his palm and pretended not to know what he had lost. She felt his pulse and found it and nodded, giving him back a little of his name. Did it stop? Marek asked, because boys need small answers when the big ones are practicing their entrances. It stopped for now, Lenka said, not lying. The thread broke. The soloist, Petra said, half to herself, half to the recorder that was still dutiful in her pocket. Silver against silver. Spoken against. He closed his eyes because the ceiling behind them wanted to be a web and he would not grant it. He thought of the ethnomusicologist's staff paper with its quiet marks and felt the thin, mean satisfaction that comes when an instruction has been defeated by the simplest defiance. Cut the line that tells the others how to behave. He knew it would not be enough for always. He took for now in both hands. They loaded him. The doors banged in a rhythm the city recognizes as living. The siren refused to sing. He smiled a little because the siren had learned to say less. Back in the workshop, the thimble lay where it had fallen. In the basement, needles rested. In the street, people tried new words and found they preferred the old ones that tell children to go to bed even if everyone knows no one will sleep. He felt himself go down into the dark of anesthetic and did not fight. If she wanted to measure his mouth while he slept, she would find no breath to pin. He dreamed of a hand unclenching and thread falling without resisting. He dreamed of women singing wrong on purpose so a song could not be stolen from them and made correct. He dreamed of a registrar writing reopened in a ledger that had learned how to blush. He woke with silence in the room, followed him, polite as a clerk. He understood then the shape of what he had purchased. He was not sure he could afford it. The web lay slack, the thimble dented, the thread from beneath it cut. The scissors lay broken, their blessing spent. Radek survived and was pulled back to the street, but the quiet did not release him. It went with him, learned his breath, and waited. Morning made the basement look like a practical joke that had lost its nerve. The web lay in sullen drifts of wire, the mannequin had stopped pretending to be posture, and the thimble, dented by a single unremarkable blow, sat under a cage like a coin nobody claimed. Photographs were taken because photographs are democracy's favorite lie. The frames flattened everything into knowable surfaces. Even the dent agreed to be evidence. By noon, the ministry had a name for it: an arsonist hoax exposing unsafe conditions. The liaison, restored to his natural size by daylight, stood before microphones and turned the city into a sentence where the predicate was stability. He said the word conspiracy with a smile that asked people to congratulate themselves for not believing in one. He gestured toward the hole as if it had been designed for pointing. The order to demolish arrived 2 hours later with the bureaucratic neatness of bad news that plans to travel. Heavy machines took position at dusk. The street learned again what engines mean when they clear their throats. The crew did everything right. They bit through brick and culture with equal appetite, lowered the walls into heaps, salted the heaps with water so dust would behave, and rolled the site flatter than the map that had denied the basement. They left a sign wired to a fence: redevelopment pending, because development is a lullaby that works even on cities. Officially, the workshop ended that day. Unofficially, people still heard knocking. Not at the fence. The fence was obedient. In the alleys near the site, doors nobody remembered having noticed began to cough politely for attention. A varnished rectangle would appear between posters. A latch that hadn't been there the week before would lift itself into familiarity. A frame would imply an entrance on a wall too thin to hold one. The knocks were gentle, always from the inside. The bodies that could be saved were saved. Svoboda wrote obstruction, gradual into forms that prefer numbers, not adverbs. She handed the coil in the dish to the chain of custody with a face that refused to dramatize. The 2 officers were buried with homilies that remembered their names. The watchman's family declined the ministry's statement about hoaxes and accepted instead a municipal stipend that did not mention song. The survivors did not go back to speaking. The girl from the pushchair learned to sing with a whistle pressed to her lips. The tune came out as breath, a thin metallic bird. A boy with the threadmaker's smile compiled a list of ways to answer without mouth. Palms, pen, eyes, and wrote better beside 2 of them, not as a judgment, as a mercy. Adela kept her clipboard. When she needed to say yes, she wrote yes. When she needed to say no, she wrote it twice. If anyone asked her whether she would recover voice, she wrote, "I am not a room you can reopen," and then, if necessary, something kind. Petra stayed late at her desk with the recorder's files open and her fingers idle, as if hands starved of buttons might recall loop, cinch, cross on their own. On a good evening, she filed images into evidence, and into a private folder she named nothing and salted with wrong dates. On a worse evening, she walked the river until the glow off the water made her feel like a negative being bathed into visibility. She kept one print on her wall against sense and habit: the beam flare that looked like a knife lit edge on. If you asked, she said it was a reminder that light misbehaves. Lenka submitted her report on time. She used phrases like heat discontinuity and unexplained suppression because the language of engineering has learned how to be brave without boasting. She recommended, with a steadiness that gave itself away as fury, that future structural seals be treated as postponements, not solutions. The captain called her into his office and thanked her aloud. The thanks did not change what would be filed, but the respect altered the air. Merrick spoke too softly for a month and then remembered how to speak. The white strip on his lip faded to a whisper of scar, a parenthesis that made his mouth look as if it had almost said something and thought better of it. He carried needles in a plastic tube in his pocket as a talisman against needles. When he met the boy with the threadmaker's smile on a tram platform, he said hello and meant it. The boy lifted a hand and meant it back. 2 stops later, Merrick disembarked early because something about the regularity of the walk signal chirp had begun to feel like counting. Roddick resigned on a Friday because resignations are tidier when the weekend can be blamed. He turned in his badge and the keys that open only ordinary locks. The captain shook his hand and did not say, "You did enough," because men who have stood in the same rooms know there is no such sentence. He packed the small ceremony of his desk into a cardboard box. Plants, 2 pens that wrote every time, a printout of the staff paper with the ethnomusicologist's marks, and left a note on Petra's keyboard that said, "Sing wrong when you can." He didn't sign. She knew. He returned the broken silver scissors to the sacristan wrapped in linen. She took the halves in both palms, as if the instrument's refusal had elevated it to relic. "You brought them back." she said, and did not ask whether they had done what scissors are for. She laid the pieces in a velvet drawer beside chalice spoons and a fork that had cheered weddings. "We will not mend them," she added, closing the drawer with a finality that released him. "Some things work once and spend themselves. Let them rest." Dr. Eliska Horikova presented a paper under a different title to an audience that did not know what, exactly, they were being spared. She spoke about the morphology of lullabies and the ethics of collecting. She used the word canon as if it belonged to music and not artillery. At questions she said that songs build houses in people and that those houses later determine the neighborhoods they are willing to live in. A man with tidy hair asked if this was political. She said all choirs are. She walked home under lamplight that liked its own reflection in puddles and hummed Wrong to Feel Safe. The journalist with the eyebrows published one more piece and then didn't. The last post stayed up for 16 minutes. A photograph of the hole at night, captioned "You're looking the wrong way," before being replaced by an apology to readers and partners that had not been written by his mouth. His apartment stood months afterward with small, correct signs of departure. A cup turned upside down to dry, a book face down as if it had been told to wait, a dinner receipt folded into a neat geometry that said someone had learned to be careful with paper. The file of his stories on the web turned into a series of links that led to a page that led to a page that promised the page would return soon. The microfilm at the newspaper library had been scored in the same place the old reel had, "Officer struck by needlework of singular," as if a century had chosen its tier carefully. The fence around the lot went on sagging like a belt that's lost interest. A month after the demolition, a municipal crew arrived to mark utilities for a developer and found the chalk lines refusing to take on the old address. The foreman kicked a can, looked at the plan, and kicked the can again. "Maps lie," he said, without malice, and put a new line a meter to the left. That night, a cyclist stopped in the alley one street over because he had heard a polite tapping from a flight of cellar stairs that had not existed that afternoon. He stood listening long enough to teach himself the courage to say no aloud. He went home a different way and felt foolish and lived. Rodek took rooms in a flat that had been arrears to somebody else, and coddled the illusion that the view mattered. He tried to teach himself the domesticity of noise, pots, radio, a neighbor's enthusiastic pan collection, because quiet had followed him home and hung its coat on his chair. He woke twice most nights at the exact moment between dream and remembering. He would lie on his back and feel the room count loop, cinch cross not as sound, but as the way shadows arranged themselves on a wall. When it began, he would hum Wrong on purpose, the way children do to break a game they've grown to fear winning. On better nights, the wrongness held. On worse nights, he would get up and boil water and let the steam make an honest shape in the dark. He visited Adela on a Tuesday when the trams rang like polite bells. She had learned to write faster, the letters still blunt with intention. He asked how she was, and she wrote here. He said he had left the job that asked him to carry rooms home in his chest. She wrote good and then, under the same word, sorry, because a mouth is not necessary for manners. He told her the story he could tell. Thread that had believed itself instruction, a line cut, a choir undone. She wrote doors and drew a small rectangle and shaded it as if shadow were a kind of ink. He nodded. "I hear them too," he said, which was not exactly true. He felt them, and the difference mattered less now. People in the neighborhood made a pact they would later deny. If a knock arrived from the wrong side of a door, they would not answer. They spoke more gently to children. They taught them the lullabies that survived in families that had not liked being collected. When someone began to hum a tune that kept time too well, another someone would sing the wrong note on purpose and everyone would laugh, and the wrongness would be an agreed-upon shield. The city found its register again. Traffic, bargaining, the chime of cafe cups, and beneath it a low intention like a river. "We will not be tuned by strangers." The ministry released a report on redevelopment that contained 3 photographs of other buildings and a thermometer of optimism. The lieutenant who had signed Rodek's assignment memo signed a new paper that retired the case into the borehole of resources reallocated. Somewhere a clerk, promoted and coughing less, stamped a form complete and allowed himself to believe that words can make a deed final by posture alone. The stamp left a purple bruise on paper that glowed like nostalgia. The evidence locker learned its own habits. The coil in the dish sulked into a tighter spiral. The dented thimble made a private sound against the tray when the room settled for the night. The bag of beaded wire rolled back and forth a finger's width on foam, as if remembering the idea of gravity had pleased it once. On a slow evening, the locker guard found that the inventory room had its own pressure. He turned the radio on to a station where the hands play scales wrong on purpose and felt the air lighten. Rodek kept appointments with the ethnomusicologist long after their usefulness expired. They took coffee in a room that insisted on its acoustics. She brought him new staff paper and taught him how to draw stress marks so his own breath would not trust the count. He told her about old women who sang their versions with a stubbornness that sounded like grace. She said, "So long as grandmothers are vain about their dialects, we'll be safe." They both knew it was hope performing an honest job. In the end, the city did what cities do when they survive a neat horror. It filed it by feeling rather than by fact. People remembered the way foam slid off silver and forgot the part where two men had been corrected into silence forever. They repeated the line about hoaxes because it fit the mouth. They instructed themselves, without boasting of it, to be skeptical of any door too polite to be there in the morning. When spring came, shop windows hung lace again, cheap and cheerful. Some shoppers stood and admired the way light made pattern. Others crossed the street, embarrassed by their own caution. A few traced loops, cinch, cross on the glass with a finger and then wiped it away, superstitious about memory. On his last night in the flat before giving it up for a place with fewer interior doors, Rodek woke to a knock that wasn't a knock so much as a suggestion that he remember the shape. It came from the wardrobe, from the old wood that had learned long ago how to warp in weather. He sat up and let the room make its case. When it had finished, he said, softly, faithfully, wrong on purpose, "Not tonight." The quiet leaned against him for a minute, then straightened itself like a clerk adjusting a stack of forms and went to sulk elsewhere. He lay back and felt the old, simple animal relief of not being measured. He wrote one more line in his notebook before surrendering to what sleep had left. Not a theory, a caution. When you cannot stop a song, refuse its count. He closed the book on that sentence like a lid. We could tell you there is no more knocking in Zizkov. It would be a comfort and a lie. We could tell you the city learned a single lesson. That would be too neat for this place, which learns in increments, forgets in festivals, and carries its scars where tourists won't see them. If you walk past the fence at dusk and you hear the smallest patient sound, thimble against wood, needle in its tin, the hush a room makes when it hopes you will open it. Do not be brave and do not be kind. Be exact. Count wrong. Sing wrong. Keep your mouth for truths that need saying. In Prague, beware the thread that listens, for it sows silence where truth should be. And that is where we leave you. Streets rinsed by a late rain, doors certain of themselves, and a city that hums in its own disobedient key. This has been